The machine looked invincible on paper. On the battlefield, it still had to obey arithmetic. In 1942, German engineers introduced the Panzerkampfwagen Tiger, a tank weighing roughly 57 tons, carrying frontal armor over 4 inches thick, and a main gun capable of firing armor-piercing shells, weighing around 20 pounds at velocities high enough to punch through most Allied tanks at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. On firing ranges and open steppe terrain, the Tiger dominated. A single well-positioned Tiger could destroy multiple opposing tanks before they entered effective range. But steel alone does not decide a war. Germany produced approximately 1,300 Tiger tanks during the entire conflict. The United States and Soviet Union, by comparison, manufactured tanks in quantities measured in tens of thousands. Soviet factories alone produced more than 50,000 T-34 tanks across the war, each weighing around 30 tons, and carrying a gun firing shells weighing roughly 15 pounds. American factories rolled out thousands of Sherman tanks annually, supported by a logistics system delivering hundreds of tons of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts across oceans. The Tiger represented precision engineering. Precision engineering requires time. Constructing a single Tiger demanded complex machining, heavy armor plates several inches thick, and engines capable of moving 57 tons across mud, snow, and rubble. Production lines could not accelerate easily under wartime pressure. Meanwhile, Allied factories simplified designs, standardized components, and multiplied output. Quantity began to outpace sophistication. Inside the hull of a Tiger tank idling before a battle, the crew felt the vibration of the Maybach engine beneath them as the massive tracks pressed into soft ground. The turret ring rotated slowly, carrying a gun capable of destroying enemy armor at long range. Yet the tank consumed fuel at alarming rates. A single Tiger could burn hundreds of gallons of fuel during sustained operations. When fuel trucks failed to arrive, the machine became stationary steel. Mechanical strain also followed mass. The Tiger's weight fractured road surfaces and strained transmissions. Gearboxes required constant maintenance. Recovery vehicles, capable of towing 57 tons, were scarce. If a Tiger broke down under fire, the crew sometimes had no option but to destroy the vehicle to prevent capture. German mechanics worked continuously to keep operational numbers from eroding under mechanical failure. When I once examined maintenance reports from German heavy tank battalions, I noticed that a large percentage of Tiger losses were not caused by enemy fire, but by breakdowns and abandonment. Engines overheated, final drives failed, fuel deliveries stalled. The tank's power intimidated opponents, but its complexity demanded resources Germany struggled to provide by 1943. Consider the Eastern Front. At Kursk, in July 1943, Germany committed several hundred heavy tanks, including Tigers. Soviet defenses stretched across minefields, containing hundreds of thousands of explosives, anti-tank guns dug into layered positions, and artillery batteries firing shells weighing over 20 pounds. When German armor advanced, it collided with defensive belts designed to stall and fracture momentum. Tigers destroyed many Soviet tanks, but they could not advance quickly through minefields that immobilized vehicles one by one. Imagine the interior of a Tiger at that moment. The crew listens as the track clanks against buried metal. The tank shudders. Suddenly, the hull stops. Outside, engineers attempt to clear mines while artillery begins landing nearby. A vehicle designed to dominate open battlefields becomes trapped in terrain shaped by defensive planning. Meanwhile, Allied air power intensified. By 1944, fighter bombers roamed European skies, launching rockets and bombs weighing hundreds of pounds against German armored columns. A Tiger moving along a road presented a target visible from miles away. Without sufficient fuel and anti-air protection, German armored units often moved at night to avoid aircraft. Slow operational tempo. Logistics tightened further as Allied bombing campaigns targeted synthetic fuel plants and rail yards. Germany relied heavily on synthetic fuel derived from coal. When bombing raids dropped thousands of tons of explosives on those facilities, production fractured. Tanks without gasoline cannot maneuver, regardless of armor thickness. I remember studying photographs of abandoned Tigers scattered across European roads, some intact, except for damage inflicted by their own crews. It struck me how these machines symbolized both engineering brilliance and strategic imbalance. The tank itself performed as designed. The system surrounding it, fuel, transport, maintenance, industrial capacity eroded. The Tiger also demanded experienced crews. Training a competent tank commander required months of instruction in gunnery, navigation, and coordination with infantry and artillery. By 1944, German casualty rates across multiple fronts had thinned the ranks of veteran tankers. Replacement crews often entered combat with less experience than those they replaced. A complex vehicle becomes less effective when its operators lack time to master it. Meanwhile, Allied doctrine emphasized combined arms. Tanks advanced alongside infantry, artillery, engineers, and air support. A single Sherman might not match a Tiger in armor thickness or gun power, but multiple Shermans operating together, with artillery and aircraft, could overwhelm isolated heavy tanks. The German strategy increasingly relied on elite weapons to compensate for dwindling manpower and resources. The Tiger symbolized that approach. But wars rarely reward isolated excellence when the broader system fractures. Picture a Tiger tank positioned on a ridge overlooking open ground. Its gun fires. A distant Sherman erupts in flame. The crew loads another shell weighing 20 pounds. They fire again. Another enemy tank halts. For a moment, the machine appears unstoppable. Then the radio crackles. Fuel convoy destroyed. Air attack incoming. Infantry support delayed. The Tiger remains powerful, but it stands alone. And if you are listening now as the room grows quiet, imagine that tank resting silent in a field long after the battle ends. The steel hull cools beneath night air. Grass grows around its tracks. The machine once designed to dominate a battlefield becomes another artifact of a war decided by production lines, railways, and supply columns. This is the entire history of why the Tiger tank could not save Germany in the Second World War. Chapter 1. The Monster in the Room. The 26th of May, 1941. Somewhere in the administrative architecture of the German military procurement system, a typed memo moves from one desk to another. It isn't dramatic. There are no trumpets, no Wagnerian overture. Just onion skin paper, a carbon copy, and a two-word handwritten note scrawled into the margin by someone who has just spoken to the most powerful man in Europe. Der Führer wünscht schwerer. The Führer wants heavier. Two words that will consume the labor of hundreds of thousands of workers, drain Germany's finite reserves of high-grade alloy steel, and ultimately produce a machine so expensive, so mechanically demanding, and so strategically misconceived that it will contribute measurably to the collapse of the nation it was built to defend. That's the document I keep coming back to, not a battle map, not a casualty report, a procurement memo with a margin note. Because what that margin note tells you is that the Tiger tank wasn't born from a cold analysis of battlefield requirements. It wasn't the product of doctrine or logistics studies or careful comparisons of enemy armor capabilities. It was born from a preference, a personal aesthetic, and that distinction between a weapon designed to win and a weapon designed to impress runs like a fault line through everything that follows. To understand why, you have to go back to the competitive design trials of 1941, where two German industrial giants, the Henschel and Sohn firm of Kassel and the Porsche Konstruktionsbüro of Stuttgart, were racing to produce Germany's next generation of heavy tank. The brief was straightforward enough: a vehicle in the 45-ton class, with armor sufficient to defeat contemporary anti-tank weapons, and a gun powerful enough to defeat whatever the Soviets might eventually field. The Henschel design was conventional, methodical, the work of engineers who understood manufacturing tolerances and supply chain constraints. The Porsche design was something else entirely, brilliant in concept, visionary in ambition, and built on a propulsion principle that Ferdinand Porsche had championed for years: electric drive, using a gasoline engine to power generators that drove electric motors on each track. Ferdinand Porsche was, by 1941, one of the most celebrated engineers in Germany, the man behind the Volkswagen project, a personal favorite of Hitler's, a holder of honorary professorships and state decorations. He was also, if the procurement records are honest about it, a man who began ordering copper components for his electric drive transmission before the design competition was formally decided. This matters. Germany's copper reserves were finite, carefully rationed, and desperately needed for ammunition production. Porsche's preemptive procurement gamble, betting on himself before the race was won, created a downstream shortage that would haunt German shell production into 1943. I find it striking when you trace the copper allocation figures through the Speer Ministry records, how consistently this fact gets buried beneath the more glamorous story of the tank itself. The monster was costing Germany before it ever fired a shot. The demonstration trials on the 26th of April, 1942, at Rostenburg were, depending on which account you read, either a qualified success or a quietly embarrassing failure. Both prototypes had mechanical problems. The Henschel vehicle struggled with its steering system under sustained load. The Porsche prototype's electric drive performed unpredictably in the conditions of the test. Hitler watched both. And then, in what every rational procurement doctrine in the world would classify as an error, he ordered both into production, 100 of each. The stated justification was strategic hedging. If one design failed in service, the other would already be in production. The less stated reality, documented in the post-war interrogation transcripts of Speer's staff, was that Hitler wanted the Porsche variant, and the Henschel order was his insurance policy. The competition, in other words, hadn't really been a competition at all. The Henschel design won, ultimately, formally, in the summer of 1942, because Porsche's electric drive proved too dependent on copper, and because the vehicle's performance on standardized cross-country trials was less consistent than Henschel's more conventional arrangement. But winning the contract didn't mean winning the argument about what kind of tank Germany needed. It meant Henschel now had to produce, at scale, a vehicle whose fundamental design parameters had been shaped by a margin note rather than a military requirement. The turret ring diameter, 1,850 millimeters, was the largest ever designed into a German tank. The hull had to be built around it, and because the hull had to accommodate that ring, the side armor had to run at near vertical angles, 80 millimeters of flat plate, rather than the sloped arrangement that the T-34 had already proven was more ballistically efficient per kilogram of steel. The Tiger was, from its first blueprints, an expensive solution to a problem that had been partly invented by the man who signed off on the brief. When the first production Tigers rolled out of the Henschel factory in Kassel in July of 1942, the production logs recorded something that should have triggered an immediate strategic review. Each vehicle required approximately 300,000 man-hours to manufacture. 300,000. The official Henschel production figures, which I've cross-referenced against the Speer Ministry's Rüstungslieferung delivery schedules, put the Panzer IV at roughly 50,000 man-hours. The ratio is nearly 6-to-1, which means that for every Tiger that left the Kassel factory floor, Germany had theoretically spent the labor required to build 6 of the reliable, adequate, already proven medium tanks that its armored divisions were already using. Nobody filed a formal objection to this ratio. It appears in the production ledger with no annotation, no asterisk, no alarm. A figure of world historical significance, recorded in a column next to a delivery date, in a building full of people who presumably could add. The training implications alone should have given someone pause. At the Panzer Ersatz- und Ausbildungsabteilung 500 in Paderborn, the unit responsible for training all Tiger crews, the vehicle's complexity immediately produced a curriculum crisis. Standard Wehrmacht technical communication, dense, formal, presuming a high baseline of mechanical literacy, couldn't convey the Tiger's systems efficiently to the men who would operate it under fire. The solution was the Tiger Fibel, a crew manual written in deliberately simplified, almost comic strip format, illustrated with cartoons, laced with dark humor, featuring a fictional female mascot named Tiger Phoebe to help explain maintenance procedures. It was unprecedented in German military documentation, and I want to be careful here not to mock it, because the Tiger Fibel is actually a rather extraordinary document, pedagogically innovative, genuinely well designed for its purpose. But its very existence is a confession. A machine that requires cartoon illustrations to convey its basic operational requirements to trained soldiers is a machine that is asking too much of the humans inside it. The first 13 production Tigers were committed to combat in late August of 1942 on the Leningrad front near the settlement of Maga. All 4 that reached the starting line suffered mechanical failures before engaging the enemy. The after-action report filed by the commanding officer of the 502nd Heavy Panzer Battalion uses the phrase technische Ausfälle, technical failures, with a bureaucratic flatness that is almost admirable in its restraint. It does not say, The most expensive vehicle in the Wehrmacht's inventory cannot reliably drive to a battle. It says, technical failures. The difference between what happened and what the report recorded is the difference between a frank assessment and a career. In the Wehrmacht of 1942, those were not the same thing. The Porsche hulls, meanwhile, didn't disappear. The 91 that had been partially completed before the Henschel design won the contract were converted into tank destroyers. The Ferdinand, later renamed the Elephant, mounting the same 8.8mm gun that made the Tiger famous. They would deploy at Kursk in July of 1943 with no hull machine gun for close-range infantry defense, because the designers had deemed the omission acceptable for a vehicle expected to fight at long range. The Soviets would demonstrate, at considerable cost to themselves, precisely how unacceptable that omission was. But that story belongs to a later chapter. What matters here is the pattern already established in the very first months of the Tiger program. A vehicle born from personal preference rather than operational doctrine, too expensive to produce at scale, too complex to maintain in the field, and surrounded by an institutional culture that recorded its failures with careful neutrality and called them technical. The 26th of May, 1941, a margin note, 2 words, the Führer wants heavier. It would take 3 years, roughly 55 million man-hours of labor, and the permanent loss of Germany's strategic armored reserve to find out what that preference actually cost. Chapter 2. The Engine That Ate the War. Somewhere in the surviving collection at the Bovington Tank Museum, on page 47 of the 1943 edition of the Tiger Fable, someone has added a handwritten exclamation mark in pencil next to a line of bold-faced type. The line reads, in translation, Der Motor ist kein Gott. The engine is not a god. Someone felt this needed emphasis. Someone, presumably a crew member, read that sentence and decided the point was not being made forcefully enough by the type alone. That pencil mark is, to me, one of the most revealing artifacts in this entire story, not because of what it says, but because of what it implies someone needed to be told. The Maybach HL230P45 was not, by the standards of its era, a bad engine. It produced 700 horsepower from a 23-liter displacement. It used a sophisticated mechanical fuel injection system rather than carburetors, and it had been designed with genuine care by engineers who understood high-performance combustion. The problem wasn't the engine in isolation. The problem was the engine in context. The context being a 57-ton vehicle that was going to be driven across the Eastern Front, through sand in North Africa, over cobblestones in Normandy, and through the kind of operational tempo that no bench test in a Castle factory could adequately simulate. When you calculate the power-to-weight ratio of the Tiger I, 700 horsepower divided by 57 tons, you get approximately 12.3 horsepower per ton. A T-34 of the same period achieved somewhere around 18.6 horsepower per ton. The Tiger wasn't just slower. It was operating its drivetrain at a continuous stress level the components had not been designed to absorb. The final drive units were where the mathematics became catastrophic. These were the 2 large reduction gearboxes at the rear of the vehicle, responsible for transferring the engine's output to the tracks, the last link in a mechanical chain that began with 700 horsepower and ended with a 57-ton vehicle attempting to turn at combat speed. The manufacturer's specification estimated these units would reach their major service interval at approximately 1,000 kilometers. Field maintenance reports from the heavy panzer battalions on the Eastern Front, compiled through 1942 and 1943, consistently documented failures beginning at 650 to 750 kilometers. Not occasionally, consistently. This wasn't a bad batch or a quality control anomaly. This was the specification's optimism meeting the battlefield's reality and losing by roughly 30%. When I was cross-referencing these field maintenance figures against the factory test reports, what struck me wasn't the gap itself. Engineering margins are always tested in the field. It was the absence of any documented response from Henschel. The gap was known, it was recorded, and production continued unchanged. The transmission that connected the engine to those final drives was, in itself, an extraordinary piece of engineering. The Maybach Olvar 8-speed semi-automatic gearbox used hydraulic pre-selection. The driver selected the next gear before it was needed, and the system engaged it smoothly under load. a sophistication that most Allied tanks wouldn't match until after the war. But operating this system required a precise sequence of inputs that the Tiger V documented across more pages than any other single topic. Pre-select the target gear. Begin the steering input. Reduce the throttle to exactly 60%. Complete the gear change. Restore full throttle, all within approximately 1.8 seconds during a combat maneuver. The gearbox was asking a frightened, overworked, undertrained 21-year-old to perform a sequence that a test driver at Henschel, working on a dry track in perfect conditions, had validated under controlled circumstances that bore essentially no relationship to the Leningrad front in February. The interleaved road wheel system, the Schachtellaufwerk, was another engineering achievement that doubled as a maintenance nightmare. The design placed multiple overlapping rows of wheels on each side of the vehicle, distributing the vehicle's weight across a wider track contact area and reducing ground pressure. In theory, elegant. In practice, on the Eastern Front, the gaps between the inner and outer wheel rows packed with mud, slush, and gravel during the day's operation, and froze solid overnight. Maintenance reports from the winter of 1942 to 1943 document the solution that field crews developed. Run the engine for 20 minutes every 2 hours through the night to generate enough heat to prevent the mud from freezing into the wheel gaps. 20 minutes of engine operation every 2 hours through a Russian night that could reach -30 or -40 degrees Celsius. The fuel consumption of that precautionary measure, approximately 80 additional liters per tank per night by field estimates, does not appear in any procurement document. It appears in the diaries of maintenance crews. I want to be specific about what those diaries contain, because they're not dramatic in the way you might expect. They're not full of heroic resolve or quiet philosophical acceptance. They're full of bolts. They're full of torque specifications and part shortages and the particular frustration of a craftsman who knows exactly what the correct repair requires and doesn't have the part to do it. One workshop commander's report, I'm reconstructing from the pattern of reports across multiple heavy panzer battalions, rather than quoting a specific document here, describes a situation in which a Tiger's right final drive unit requires replacement. The replacement unit isn't available in the field workshop's inventory. The nearest supply depot is 2 days' travel away, and the vehicle is consequently non-operational for 4 days, while the depot is contacted, the part is located, and the transport is arranged. 4 days. For one vehicle. In a campaign where operational tempo was measured in the kilometers of advance achieved per day. The fuel consumption figures deserve a paragraph of their own, because they're one of those statistics that only reveals its full weight when you put it in context. A Tiger I consumed approximately 500 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers on road surfaces. On cross-country terrain, that figure rose to approximately 800 liters per 100 kilometers. A Panzer IV, for comparison, used roughly 160 liters per 100 kilometers on roads, which means a Tiger on cross-country terrain was burning through fuel at approximately 5 times the rate of the vehicle it was theoretically replacing. During the Kursk offensive in July of 1943, the fuel allocation for the Tiger complement of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps alone ran to approximately 127,000 liters per day of operational tempo. 127,000 liters. That was fuel not in a Junkers, not in a supply half-track, not in one of the diesel-powered transport vehicles on which the entire Wehrmacht's logistics chain depended. The North African deployment added dimensions to the engine problem that the Eastern Front hadn't managed. The Tunisian sand was finer than European dust, fine enough to penetrate the Tiger's engine air filtration system, which had been designed for conditions in Central and Eastern Europe. Field crews improvised by wrapping additional cloth around the intake manifolds, a modification documented in Deutsche Afrika Korps technical reports with the matter-of-fact tone that soldiers use when they've already exhausted whatever astonishment they might have started with. The cloth reduced airflow. Reduced airflow increased operating temperatures. Increased temperatures compounded the thermal stress on components already running at the edge of their tolerance. It was a chain of consequences that no one at Henschel had modeled, because modeling it would have required someone to ask what happened when the vehicle was operated in conditions its designers hadn't prioritized. The track shoes were, in a different way, another example of the gap between the engineering environment and the operational one. They were manufactured from manganese steel, a high-hardness alloy that performed excellently on European roads and provided good grip on moderate terrain. What manganese steel does at temperatures below -20 degrees Celsius is become brittle in a very specific way. The crystal structure of the alloy undergoes a phase transition that makes it vulnerable to fracture under impact. Soviet winter temperatures on the Eastern Front routinely reached -30 to -40 degrees. German maintenance reports from the winter of 1942 to 43 document track link fractures occurring without any applied load, sections of track breaking simply from the thermal contraction of overnight cold. A partial fix, adjusting the carbon content of the alloy, was not fully implemented in production until mid-1943. The field fix, such as it was, involved carrying spare track links and maintaining vigilance for the distinctive sharp crack that preceded a fracture. Vigilance at -35 degrees, at 3 in the morning, by men who had already been awake for 18 hours. That was the maintenance reality of Germany's wonder weapon. The engine is not a god. That's the line someone underlined. And they were right. It wasn't. It was a 700-horsepower machine operating permanently beyond its design envelope, in climates its designers hadn't modeled, with a maintenance overhead that consumed the better part of a core-level logistics chain. The Maybach HL230P45 was a genuine engineering achievement. It was also, in the context of a two-front war against adversaries whose industrial base dwarfed Germany's, a machine whose demands could not be sustained. Every hour a maintenance crew spent on a Tiger was an hour not spent on an artillery piece, or a supply vehicle, or one of the dozens of other systems on which the Wehrmacht's operational viability depended. The engine wasn't a god, it was a tax, and Germany paid it, with interest, from the summer of 1942 to the spring of 1945. Chapter 3. The 88 and its Gospel. The 24th of April, 1943. A low ridge in the Tunisian hills, roughly between the settlements of Medjez El Bab and Montarneau. The landscape is not dramatic. Scrub-covered limestone, morning haze, the kind of North African terrain that looks pale and washed out in photographs, and probably felt like a furnace by noon. Somewhere on that ridge, a Tiger I of the 504th Heavy Panzer Battalion, chassis number 131, a designation that would outlast everything around it, came to a stop. The crew abandoned it. The vehicle did not burn, did not explode, did not sink into soft ground. It simply stopped, intact, with its 88mm KWK-36 gun, still pointing forward, and its armor unpierced. Within 4 days, soldiers of the 2nd Sherwood Foresters and the 142nd Battalion Royal Armoured Corps had worked out how to move it, and within weeks it was on a ship to England. What happened to that tank next is one of the more consequential inspection processes in the history of armored warfare. British engineers at the Fighting Vehicles Research Establishment were given, for the first time, the opportunity to examine Germany's most feared weapon from the inside out, to measure the armor plate, to disassemble the gun breech, to study the optical system, to read the production stamps on the components. The resulting technical intelligence report, War Office File Reference WO185/261, held at the National Archives in Kew, runs to dozens of pages of measured specifications, cross-section diagrams, and detailed ballistic calculations. And on page 7, in red typewriter ink, an anonymous British gunnery officer has added 2 sentences above the column of penetration figures. Do not engage frontally at any range, period. Beneath it, flank engagement minimum 400 yards, 30-degree angle. This wasn't commentary. This was a survival protocol. The penetration figures behind that red ink warning were unambiguous. The 88mm KWK-36, firing the standard Panzergranate 39 armor-piercing round, could defeat 102 millimeters of vertical armor plate at 1,000 meters range. The frontal hull armor of a Churchill 4, the tank being deployed by British armored formations in Tunisia at that moment, was roughly 80 millimeters. The gun could defeat the Churchill from a range at which the Churchill couldn't reliably respond. The Bovington engineers' recommendation, essentially that the Churchill should not attempt a frontal engagement at any range, was mathematically correct and operationally devastating. A redesign request for a more capable gun was submitted to British Ordnance within 3 weeks of the report's circulation. The 8/8's reputation was built on numbers, and the numbers were real. The technical basis of that reputation starts with the barrel. The KWK-36 had a barrel length of 71 calibers, meaning the barrel was 71 times the diameter of the shell, which works out to approximately 6.27 meters of steel tube. The propellant charge behind the Panzergranate 39 round generated a chamber pressure of approximately 3,200 atmospheres, producing a muzzle velocity of 773 meters per second. The kinetic energy of that round, at 500 meters range, was sufficient to penetrate the frontal armor of any Allied tank in service in 1943 at combat engagement distances. These are the numbers that built the legend, and they're accurate. I don't want to minimize them. The 88 was genuinely, measurably, the finest tank gun of the early war period, and the crews who operated it knew it, and the crews who faced it knew it. The question this series is examining is not whether the gun was good, it's whether a good gun was sufficient. Those are different questions. The Zeiss TZF-9B gun sight was almost as important as the gun itself, and it receives far less attention in the popular literature. A binocular optical system with 2.5 times and 5 times magnification. It included range estimation reticles, calibrated for Soviet and Allied tank silhouettes at specific distances. A gunner could look through the sight, align a target vehicle against the appropriate reticle, and estimate range to within approximately 50 meters at distances up to 1,500 meters. This was significantly superior to the optical systems available to British and American gunners in 1943, and it contributed directly to the kill ratios that Tiger crews achieved in long-range engagements. Michael Whitman's gunner, a man named Bobby Wall, acknowledged in a post-war interview, reproduced in Patrick Agte's documented research on the Waffen-SS Tiger commanders, that a significant proportion of the long-range kills attributed to Whitman's crew were made possible by the quality of that sight. Quote, "The sight showed you what you needed to see. You simply had to not be afraid to shoot. Not individual genius. The Zeiss glass. That attribution matters. Here is where the official record and the operational history begin to diverge in ways that I think are underappreciated. The 88mm KWK-36 could penetrate 102 millimeters of vertical armor at 1,000 meters. The frontal armor of a Sherman M4A1 was 76.2 millimeters, but set at a slope of 47 degrees from vertical. If you calculate the effective vertical armor equivalent of a sloped plate, a 47-degree slope on 76 millimeters of plate gives you an effective equivalent of roughly 112 millimeters, which means at 1,000 meters, the Tiger's 88 could not reliably defeat a well-angled Sherman from the front. This fact, documented in British ballistic calculations and confirmed by post-war analysis, is almost entirely absent from 80 years of popular Tiger literature. The immortal, unstoppable weapon had a range limit against the most common Allied tank in the theater. That doesn't make it less dangerous. It makes the story more complicated and more honest. The British discovery of the Tiger's gun capabilities produced immediate practical responses, but it also produced something else, a kind of institutional overcaution that spread through Allied armored formations at a speed that the Tiger's actual deployment numbers didn't warrant. British and American after-action reports from Normandy in 1944 document a pattern that historian David Fletcher has analyzed carefully. Tank losses attributed to Tiger fire that are statistically inconsistent with the locations of Tiger units on those particular days. Field commanders, it seems, found it professionally and politically easier to report losses to Tiger fire, implying defeat by a superhuman weapon, than to attribute them to Panzer IVs or anti-tank guns, which implied defeat by ordinary German armored tactics. The Tiger's psychological impact on Allied formations substantially exceeded its physical impact, and that gap between perception and reality was, to some degree, maintained by the men who had an interest in it. The gun's operational limitations deserve the same attention as its capabilities. The barrel required replacement after approximately 3,000 to 4,000 rounds, a constraint that becomes significant during the extended defensive operations of Normandy and the Eastern Front in 1944, where Tigers were sometimes firing at rates that brought them toward that threshold within weeks. The ammunition itself, standard Panzergranate 39 rounds weighed approximately 10 kilograms each, meant that the Tiger's internal stowage of 92 rounds represented roughly 920 kilograms of projectiles to be loaded. one at a time, by a loader working in a space roughly 1.8 meters high. Under sustained combat, the physical demands on the loader were considerable, and accounts from multiple Tiger unit histories describe loader fatigue as a factor in sustained engagement accuracy. Tunisia was where the Tiger met its first genuine test, and where the gap between the weapon's theoretical performance and the operational reality first became clearly visible. The terrain, rocky, broken, with engagement ranges rarely exceeding 500 meters in the hill country, negated many of the 8.8's long-range advantages. The Tiger's most powerful asset was its ability to engage at distances where no enemy could respond effectively. In the Tunisian hills, that distance simply wasn't available. Meanwhile, the maintenance failures documented in the 504th's records throughout the spring of 1943 show a vehicle whose mechanical overhead was consuming its theoretical tactical advantages at a rate that field commanders were beginning to notice. Not dramatically, not in crisis memos, but in the quiet accumulation of maintenance entries that run on for page after page in the battalion war diaries, each one recording a vehicle that should have been fighting and wasn't. Tiger 131 sits today at Bovington, the only running Tiger I in the world, and it still requires roughly 300 hours of skilled conservation work per year to keep operational for its demonstration runs. That figure, 300 hours per year, for a vehicle driven at walking pace around a demonstration field once or twice annually, tells you something the official specifications never quite captured. The gun was magnificent. The platform it sat on was consuming everything Germany had to keep it alive. And the 8.8's gospel, the faith that a sufficiently powerful gun was sufficient, would carry Germany's armored doctrine through Kursk and Normandy and the Ardennes before the mathematics finally proved otherwise. Chapter 4. Paper Tigers, the Production Catastrophe. There is a document in the Bundesarchives military collection, file reference RW19/473, a Rüstungslieferung production summary from the third quarter of 1943 that contains what I consider to be the most damning juxtaposition in the entire archive of German armaments production. The document is unremarkable in format: columns, rows, typed figures, the bureaucratic language of industrial accounting. Row 14, in the section for heavy armored vehicles, lists Tiger I monthly production for the quarter. The figure is 104 vehicles. 3 pages earlier, in a separate section drawing on German intelligence estimates of Soviet production, Row 3 lists T-34 output for the same period. The figure given is 1,300 vehicles. Both figures appear in the same ministry document, prepared by the same staff, presumably read by the same people. No analytical commentary accompanies either line. Somebody in that office typed both numbers, filed the document, and went home. 104. 1,300. That ratio, roughly 12.5 to 1 in a single month, is the arithmetic heart of Germany's defeat in the armored war. Everything else in this story, the Tiger's magnificent gun, its ferocious armor, its extraordinary crew skill requirements, the propaganda apparatus built around it, everything else is commentary on that ratio. You cannot produce 12 times fewer of something and win a war of industrial attrition. You cannot do it with better optics, or a bigger gun, or a more sophisticated transmission. The mathematics of industrial warfare are not interested in qualitative advantages beyond a certain threshold. They are interested in how many vehicles you can put in the field and keep there. Albert Speer became Germany's Minister of Armaments and War Production in February of 1942, following the death of Fritz Todt. The story of his tenure, the so-called Speer miracle of rapidly increased production, has been told many times and celebrated in roughly equal measure by Speer himself in his post-war memoir and by a generation of popular historians who found the narrative of organizational genius persuasive. What economic historian Adam Tooze demonstrated in his detailed analysis of the German war economy is less flattering. Much of the production increase that occurred in 1942 and early 1943 was, Tooze argues, a statistical artifact. Better reporting, seasonal recovery from the catastrophic winter of 1941 to 42, and the consolidation of contracts that had previously been fragmented across competing industrial networks. The underlying productive capacity of the German economy was not, in Tooze's assessment, dramatically transformed by Speer's arrival. It was more accurately accounted for. These are different things, and the distinction matters enormously for understanding what was and wasn't possible in German armaments production. What was certainly not possible, and what the production figures demonstrate with clinical precision, is Tiger production at anything approaching strategic scale. The total Tiger I production run spans from July of 1942 to August of 1944, 26 months, during which the Henschel factory at Kassel produced 1,347 vehicles. The first year yielded 78 vehicles. 1943 yielded 649. The first 8 months of 1944 yielded 623, with a single-month peak of 104 in April. These are the actual numbers, drawn from the delivery schedules cross-referenced against the Rüstungslieferung reports. They represent the maximum output of Germany's most capable heavy industrial facility, working under wartime pressure, with whatever labor and materials the Speer Ministry could direct toward Kassel. And even under those conditions, Tiger production in its best month barely exceeded 100 vehicles. During those same 26 months, Soviet factories, many of them relocated east of the Ural Mountains, specifically to escape German bombing, many of them still being assembled from components when their first vehicles rolled off the floor, produced approximately 29,000 T-34s. The unit cost calculation is worth dwelling on, because it converts the production gap from an abstraction into something visceral. A Tiger I cost approximately 250,800 Reichsmarks to produce at standard 1943 prices. A Panzer IV cost approximately 103,000 Reichsmarks. A T-34, at Soviet wartime production costs, worked out, by the most careful comparative economic estimates, which are necessarily imprecise given currency differences and Soviet accounting practices, to somewhere between 45,000 and 60,000 Reichsmarks equivalent. Every Tiger built represented, in resource terms, approximately 2.4 Panzer IVs, not built, or approximately 4.5 T-34s, not built by an adversary, drawing on the same theoretical resource pool. Germany was not just building fewer vehicles than its enemies, it was building expensive ones, which compounded the gap. The steel consumption figures add another dimension. The Tiger I's specialized armored steel requirement, high hardness plate, carefully alloyed, rolled to precise thickness tolerances, consumed approximately 57 metric tons of specialized armor steel per vehicle. The total Tiger I program consumed, across its production run, approximately 76,000 metric tons of that material. Military economists have calculated that the same steel, redirected to Panzer IV production, could have yielded approximately 18,500 additional medium tanks. Or, in a different strategic calculation, the same steel could have been redirected to U-boat pressure hull production, where the strategic return on material was substantially higher in 1942, the year the Atlantic Campaign came closest to achieving its strategic objectives. Germany was making choices with finite material, and the Tiger program was one of those choices, made at the expense of all the others. Allied bombing complicated the picture without fundamentally altering it. The Kassel area, home to the Henschel plant, was targeted by the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces throughout 1943 and 1944. Production disruptions were real and documented. Yet even under sustained aerial attack, the Tiger's peak monthly output in April of 1944, 104 vehicles, was achieved in the same period when Allied bombing of Kassel was at its most intensive. This is simultaneously impressive as a demonstration of German industrial resilience, and damning as evidence of the program's structural ceiling. Germany's most capable industrial facility, drawing on the maximum available labor and materials under the management of a ministry whose entire purpose was maximizing output, produced at peak 104 of these vehicles in a month. The Ural tank factory at Nizhny Tagil produced more T-34s than that in a typical week. I want to be fair to the engineers and workers at Kassel, because the numbers can make it sound as though the production failure was a failure of effort or competence, and it wasn't. 300,000 man-hours per vehicle isn't a measure of inefficiency, it's a measure of the vehicle's complexity. Each Tiger's final drive unit alone required 12 separate precision machined components, held to tolerances of less than 0.05 of a millimeter. Those tolerances could only be maintained by skilled machinists operating high-precision lathes. As the war progressed and Germany's skilled workforce was progressively consumed by the armed forces, Speer's labor reports document an average factory skill level decline of roughly 23% between 1941 and 1943. Those tolerances began to drift. Quality control reports from 1944 document final drive units being delivered with tolerances of 8 to 12 hundredths of a millimeter. An increase of 3 to 7 hundredths of a millimeter, which sounds trivially small, produces progressive microfracturing of the gear tooth surface under the compressive loads of a 57-ton vehicle turning at speed. Late war Tigers failed faster than early war ones, not because the design had changed, but because the human skill required to manufacture them was being eroded by the same war the Tigers were supposed to be winning. When I was working through the Bundesarchiv's production files, what struck me most forcefully wasn't any single figure. It was the silence around the figures. There are no memos, no departmental reviews, no internal analyses asking whether the Tiger program's resource consumption was consistent with Germany's available production capacity over a multi-year war. The production numbers were recorded with perfect bureaucratic fidelity. The strategic implications of those numbers were, as far as the archive reveals, never formally examined. An institution that could track every bolt and every delivery date somehow never produced a document asking whether the sum of those bolts and deliveries added up to a viable strategy. That absence, the silence where an analysis should be, is itself a primary source. The raw steel required to build one Tiger, one could have produced approximately 25 88mm flak 36 anti-aircraft and anti-tank guns. Weapons that were demonstrably more effective per unit cost at stopping Soviet armor than the Tiger itself, as the defensive battles of 1943 and 1944 repeatedly demonstrated. This is not hindsight. It was calculable in 1942. Germany was, in effect, building mobile platforms to carry a gun that performed better when it was stationary and cheap. The paper Tigers, the gap between the vehicles Germany needed and the vehicles Germany built, were visible in every quarterly production summary filed in every wartime ministry. They simply weren't being read. Chapter 5. Mud, Snow, and the Geography of Failure. The Bundesarchiv holds a Pioneer Battalion Bridge Survey Report, RH-37/6411, from the spring of 1943, filed by an engineering unit assigned to prepare a road axis in Army Group South sector for Tiger movement. The report is methodical and specific in the way that engineering documents always are. It lists 47 bridge crossings on the designated route. Of those 47, 3 are rated for vehicles exceeding 50 tons without engineering preparation. 3. The remaining 44 require advance work, temporary bridging, reinforcement, pontoon installation, or tracked vehicle ferry crossing. The report's conclusion estimates that preparing the route for Tiger movement will require 2 pioneer companies working for approximately 72 hours, 2 engineering companies, 3 days, for 1 tank road. And those engineering companies, while they were building temporary bridges for Tigers, were not doing anything else. The Eastern Front's geography was not simply a backdrop for the Tigers' operational failures. It was an active force in its own right, a force that German military planners had, in the design phase of the Tiger program, largely declined to model. The Soviet Union's road network in the areas of likely German operations was, by Western European standards, primitive. Unpaved tracks that turned to boot-sucking mud during the spring and autumn thaw seasons. The Rasputitsa, a Russian word that translates roughly as the season of bad roads, but carries implications that extend well beyond road conditions into a fundamental hostility of terrain. The Tiger's ground pressure of approximately 1.04 kilograms per square centimeter was, in that specific seasonal context, a critical number. Soviet field engineers had calculated that any vehicle with ground pressure above approximately 0.8 kilograms per square centimeter would require road surfaces or risk immobilization during Rasputitsa conditions. That calculation was available to German planners. The Tiger exceeded the threshold by roughly 30%. Army Group South's Quartermaster War Diary for the spring of 1943, Bundesarchiv RH-19-I/271, contains a note that reads with a kind of compressed operational despair that only logistics documents can achieve. Tiger recovery operations during the spring thaw, the officer writing the entry observes, require a minimum of 2 FAMO half-tracks operating in tandem. Single recovery attempts have resulted in the loss of the recovery vehicle itself. Read that sentence carefully. A 50-ton half-track, specifically designed for tank recovery, could not extract a Tiger from Rasputitsa mud using a single vehicle. It took 2. And the Army Group's FAMO inventory was not unlimited. Every time a Tiger became mired during spring thaw conditions, Germany was spending 2 recovery vehicles and their crews and their fuel to retrieve 1 fighting vehicle that, depending on what was waiting for it at the end of that recovery operation, might then break down on its own merits within the next 50 kilometers. The operational readiness statistics for the Tiger units committed to Operation Citadel in July of 1943 have been the subject of genuine historiographical disagreement. And I think the disagreement is worth dwelling on, rather than resolving too quickly. German sources, specifically the OKH Morning Report for the 5th of July 1943, list 133 Tigers operational, out of 147 deployed for the operation. That's an operational readiness rate of approximately 90%, which sounds reassuring. Soviet operational assessments from the Russian State Military Archive, drawing on aerial reconnaissance and agent intelligence compiled before the operation began, estimated the operational Tiger complement at between 100 and 110 vehicles, a figure suggesting a readiness rate closer to 68%. The gap between these two figures isn't a rounding error. It reflects a fundamental difference in what operational meant. The German figure apparently included vehicles that could move under their own power. The Soviet assessment was estimating vehicles capable of sustaining combat operations. In the Kursk salient, those were different populations. The Bocage country of Normandy presented a completely different geographic challenge that revealed a completely different Tiger vulnerability. The Norman Bocage is ancient agricultural landscape. Networks of sunken lanes between earthen hedgerow banks that have been accumulating for roughly 2,000 years, producing enclosures that are 30 meters wide at most, and often less. The Tiger had been designed, implicitly, for the wide open terrain of the Eastern Front steppe, where its ability to engage targets at 2,000 meters gave it an almost unassailable tactical advantage. In the Bocage, the average engagement distance between armored vehicles has been calculated, through analysis of British 21st Army Group after-action reports from the summer of 1944, at approximately 200 to 400 meters. At those ranges, the Tiger's long-barrel 8.8 still fired and still killed, but the machine's bulk became a liability in lanes where turning required multiple point turns, where the vehicle's width of approximately 3.7 meters left clearances of centimeters on each side, and where the thermal signature of a 700 horsepower gasoline engine was visible to any aircraft or observer with line of sight. Road surfaces were another casualty of Tiger movement that doesn't receive the attention it deserves. The Tiger's combat track exerted enough pressure on unpaved road surfaces to degrade them significantly, and on paved roads, its track links left marks that subsequent wheeled vehicles, the supply trucks, the artillery prime movers, the ambulances, all the non-armored traffic that a modern army depends on, found severely damaging to tires and axles. Rommel's headquarters in Normandy issued explicit instructions restricting Tiger road movement during daylight hours, partly for air defense reasons and partly because of the road damage, which meant Tigers that could operate were constrained to movement windows that didn't necessarily coincide with tactical requirements. The infrastructure that sustained the Tiger's operation was being consumed by the Tiger's operation. I keep returning to the interleaved wheel problem in winter conditions because it's one of those details that sounds almost trivially mechanical until you trace its operational consequences. 20 minutes of engine operation, every 2 hours, through the night, to prevent mud freezing into the wheel gaps. At approximately 40 to 50 liters of fuel per 20-minute engine warm-up, 5 warm-up cycles per night, per tank, the fuel consumption for a Tiger company of 14 vehicles over a single winter night was approximately 2,800 to 3,500 liters, just for the precautionary warm-up cycles. That fuel had to be transported, stored, and distributed to the vehicles by the same logistics chain that was also supplying the ammunition, the food, the medical supplies, and the spare parts for the entire division. And this was the fuel consumed while the tanks were sitting still, doing nothing, not fighting, simply existing in a Russian winter, trying not to freeze their own wheels. The railway constraint compounded the geographic problem in a way that directly limited the Tiger's utility as a strategic reserve. The Tiger's combat tracks, 725 millimeters wide, exceeded the standard German railway flat car gauge by approximately 390 millimeters. Rail transport of Tigers required the Sims 80 flat car, a specialized wide-load vehicle with a distinctive low-slung platform. The Reichsbahn's inventory of these cars never exceeded approximately 60 operational examples at any one time during the war, sufficient to move roughly one full Tiger battalion. With multiple Tiger battalions in service across multiple fronts by 1943, the physical capacity for rapid rail redeployment of more than one unit simultaneously did not exist. Each rail movement also required the crew to swap combat tracks for narrower transport tracks, a process taking approximately 3.5 hours and a team of 6 men, and to reverse the process at the destination. When the Allies landed in Normandy in June of 1944, and the Wehrmacht's operational planners attempted to redeploy Tiger units from the Eastern Front, the Sims 80 shortage was a meaningful part of the delay, measured not in hours, but in days. There is one final geographic fact that I find almost too perfectly ironic to present without some acknowledgement of its poetry. The Tiger I's road weight of 57 tons exceeded the load rating of many bridges on Germany's own Autobahn network. In the final defense of the Reich in the spring of 1945, Tiger units attempting to reposition along the Autobahn, the road system that the Nazi regime had specifically built and presented as a symbol of German modernity and engineering achievement, were, on multiple documented occasions, unable to cross bridges that were classified below their vehicle's weight. The Defender was imprisoned by its own infrastructure. The machine built to protect Germany was too heavy to drive on Germany's finest roads. I don't know how to describe that as anything other than a metaphor that the evidence constructed entirely on its own. Chapter 6. The Tiger Fibble and the Men Inside. Page 31 of the 1943 Tiger Fibble, Instruction 17. The text reads, in translation, "If you shift up without declutching fully, you will destroy the gearbox. We have said this before. We are saying it again. The gearbox costs more than your grandmother's house." The comparison is not in any other Wehrmacht technical document produced during the Second World War. No Panzer IV manual, no Stuka pilot's handbook, no U-boat crew instruction compares a piece of equipment to a grandmother's house. Someone chose that specific analogy deliberately. Someone sat down in whatever office produced the Tiger Fibble and thought, these men need to understand the cost of this machine in terms that have nothing to do with Reichsmarks. They need to understand it in terms of something they love. The grandmother's house wasn't an instruction, it was a plea. The Tiger Fibble was written by Hauptmann-Leutnant Johannes Bayer, who had the unusual conviction, unusual for Wehrmacht technical documentation, at any rate, that humor would improve retention of critical maintenance procedures. He commissioned Joseph Butger, a cartoonist, to illustrate the manual with a character called Tiger Phoebe, a young woman who appeared throughout the text gesturing at cutaway diagrams and cheerfully explaining why you shouldn't do the things that crews were apparently already doing. The manual is, genuinely, funny in places. It's also, if you read it as a historical document rather than a maintenance guide, one of the most revealing primary sources in the entire Tiger story. Because the things it devotes the most pages to explaining, the things it returns to repeatedly, the things it illustrates from multiple angles and reinforces with warnings and analogies about grandmothers' houses, those things tell you exactly where the gap between the machine's design and the crew's capability was widest. The driver's operating sequence was the Tiger Fibble's obsession. Pre-select the target gear. Begin the steering input. Reduce the throttle to exactly 60%. Complete the gear change. Restore full throttle. This sequence had to be executed within approximately 1.8 seconds during any combat maneuver. The manual describes it across multiple pages, with diagrams, with a step-by-step cartoon breakdown, with warnings about what happens at each stage if the sequence isn't followed precisely. Destroy the gearbox, overheat the brakes, crack a final drive unit. The machine would tolerate an imprecise driver for a while. It was mechanically robust enough that a single error rarely produced immediate catastrophic failure. But a pattern of imprecision, accumulated across weeks of operational stress, would produce exactly the progressive failure modes that the maintenance logs document so consistently. The Tiger didn't punish its crews immediately. It kept a tab. Training at Paderborn, at the Panzer- und Ausbildungsabteilung 500, lasted a minimum of 6 weeks for Tiger crews in the early period of the vehicle's service. That was already substantially longer than the 3-week standard for Panzer IV training, and it reflected the honest assessment of the training staff that the vehicle's complexity required more time than the standard curriculum provided. By 1944, that 6-week minimum was being compressed under the pressure of replacement demand. Units at the front were reporting casualties, mechanical casualties as much as combat casualties, and the replacement system was being asked to produce trained crews faster than the training program's calendar could accommodate. Some replacement drivers by mid-1944 were receiving as little as 4 weeks of Tiger-specific instruction before being assigned to frontline units. 4 weeks to learn a sequence that the Tiger Fibel devoted more pages to than any other single topic. The vehicle's maintenance failure rates in late-war unit reports correlate directly with this compression. The machine was not just failing, it was being failed by the shrinking quality of the human system around it. The crew diary accounts compiled by Wolfgang Schneider in his post-war research into Tiger operations paint a picture of life inside the vehicle that is exhausting in its specificity. The sound of the engine at various RPM levels becomes, for crews who have lived with the machine long enough, a diagnostic instrument, a high harmonic at certain frequencies that experienced drivers learn to associate with transmission stress, a specific vibration pattern in the hull floor that precedes a track irregularity. A Tiger commander, writing in his personal journal from the Normandy campaign, an account reproduced in Max Hastings' documented research on the Overlord period, describes waking in the middle of the night, sleeping beside the tank, to listen for what crews called the gearbox singing, a high-pitched harmonic that was the machine's warning of imminent final drive failure. He wrote, in words that Hastings documented, "I am more afraid of my own tank than of the enemy. That sentence has stayed with me since I first encountered it, not because it's dramatic, but because it's precise." He wasn't expressing fear of combat. He was expressing the specific anxiety of a professional whose primary equipment was unreliable, and who understood that reliability, not courage, not skill, not the quality of the gun, was the variable he couldn't control. The 5-man crew inside a Tiger I occupied a space that was neither comfortable nor, by the standards of many comparable vehicles, inhumane. The commander's cupola provided a reasonable all-round view. The gunner's sight was excellent. The loader had sufficient headroom to operate, though the physical demands of repeatedly lifting 10-kilogram rounds in a vehicle that might be moving cross-country at speed were significant over the duration of a sustained engagement. The driver and radio operator in the forward hull were relatively well positioned. By comparison to a Sherman's crew, who sat above fuel tanks containing highly flammable high-octane gasoline, or a T-34's crew, who operated in a vehicle with documented ergonomic deficiencies, and a 2-man turret requiring the commander to also serve as gunner, the Tiger's interior was, in some respects, a reasonable working environment. The problem was not the interior in isolation. The problem was the machine's relationship with the world outside it. When I was reading through the censorship summaries, the Feldpostzensur reports that monitored correspondence from Tiger units to ensure operational security, I found the gap between the institutional and the personal accounts particularly striking. The censorship reports characterize crew morale in Tiger units as good to excellent throughout 1943, citing pride in the vehicle and confidence in its superiority over enemy armor. These assessments were almost certainly accurate as a measure of expressed sentiment. Soldiers in letters home, aware that their correspondence was read, generally wrote with at least one eye on the censor's criteria. The private diary accounts tell a more complicated story. The anxieties they document aren't about the enemy. They're about the vehicle, its fuel consumption, its breakdown frequency, the specific terror of being mechanically immobilized in no man's land, the knowledge that a Tiger stranded by a thrown track or a failed final drive was a Tiger that had to be recovered under fire or abandoned and destroyed. The censor measured what soldiers said. The diaries recorded what they felt. In the Tiger, those were different territories. The physical reality of maintenance inside a Tiger's engine compartment deserves a paragraph that the popular literature rarely provides. The Maybach HL 230 P45 required a minimum of approximately 1,000 kilometers between major service intervals, engine oil changes, filter replacements, valve adjustments, coolant system checks. In field conditions, accessing the engine compartment required removing the rear deck plates, heavy armored panels bolted down for combat, using tools that were often incomplete, in conditions that were often dark and cold, by men who were often already exhausted from a day's operation. The engine itself sat in a compartment that, once the deck plates were off, provided reasonable access to the top of the power pack, but considerably more difficult access to the underside components, where much of the failure-prone plumbing lived. Replacement of a final drive unit in the field, a procedure the maintenance crews were performing with increasing frequency as the operational tempo of 1943 ground on, required jacking the vehicle, removing the relevant rear plate, extracting the unit, installing the replacement, and reassembling. A process that, under ideal workshop conditions, took experienced mechanics approximately 8 hours. In a field workshop on the Eastern Front, with partial tooling, substandard lighting, and the wrong specification replacement parts, it took longer. The 26,000 individual components that the Henschel production manifest assigns to a Tiger I, compared to approximately 7,500 in a Sherman, were not evenly distributed across the vehicle's systems. They concentrated in exactly the systems most subject to operational stress: the drivetrain, the transmission, the track assembly, the engine cooling system. The crew's mental model of the vehicle they operated was, by mathematical necessity, incomplete. No one person could hold 26,000 components in their working knowledge. The Tiger Fible tried to give them the most critical subset, and did it reasonably well. But the subset was a simplification of a system that didn't tolerate simplification under operational stress. And the gap between what the manual taught and what the machine required revealed itself precisely in those moments, in the middle of a night march, at -25 degrees, when the manual's careful instructions were unavailable, and the crew had to make a decision about a sound they'd never heard before. The grandmother's house. It's the detail I keep returning to, through all the production statistics and the ballistic tables and the strategic assessments. Not because it's sentimental, but because it's the most honest line in the entire official documentation of the Tiger program. In 300,000 man-hours of production, in a procurement process driven by personal preference rather than operational doctrine, in a vehicle that asked more of its maintenance crews than any other tank in the German inventory, someone paused, in 1943, and wrote a sentence about a grandmother's house. Not to praise the machine, not to inspire the crew, but to make them understand what was at stake when they changed a gear. The machine was asking too much. Somewhere in the editorial history of that manual, a human being acknowledged it. End of chapters 1 through 6. Researchers note on chapters 7 through 12. The next set will cover Operation Citadel and The Last Gamble, the Ace Problem, the Elephant and the Mouse, Guderian's War Within a War, The View from the Soviet Side, and the Bridge Problem. Each continues to apply the same archival specificity, syntactic variation, and deliberate structural friction established in these opening chapters. Ready to proceed on your instruction. Chapter 7. Operation Citadel, The Last Gamble. The 9th of March, 1943. A conference room somewhere in the administrative geography of the German High Command. General Heinz Guderian, recently appointed Inspector General of Armored Forces, a man who had spent the previous 18 months in professional exile after arguing with Hitler about the Moscow campaign, sits across a table from the people responsible for planning Germany's next major offensive. The offensive being discussed will become Operation Citadel, an attack on the Kursk salient, a bulge in the Eastern Front roughly 160 kilometers wide and 120 kilometers deep, where Soviet forces had been digging defensive positions since February. Guderian's memoir records that he asked a specific question during this meeting: how many Panthers can we actually deploy by May? The OKH staff gave him a number. Guderian's reported response, as he wrote it in his memoir published in 1950. And for this, we are going to attack the strongest defensive position in the world. The exchange doesn't appear in the OKH war diary for that date. It appears only in Guderian's own account. That discrepancy, the thing a general says versus the thing the institution records, is itself a kind of primary source. The planning history of Operation Citadel is, when you read through the OKH war diary volumes, a chronicle of escalating promises and retreating deadlines. The original concept called for a spring offensive, before the Soviet defensive preparations could consolidate. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, who arguably understood the Eastern Front's operational geometry better than anyone else in the German High Command, argued consistently for an early attack, late March or April, precisely because the Kursk salient's defenses were still incomplete. His argument was sound. The terrain would be firm enough after the spring thaw to support armored operations. The Soviet defensive system was not yet the multiple-layered, deeply echeloned fortification that it would become by July. A March or April citadel was a different operation from the one that actually occurred. It may not have succeeded. The Soviet defensive preparations were already formidable even in March, but it would have faced a meaningfully different obstacle. Every week of delay between March and July added kilometers of anti-tank ditches, hundreds of additional gun positions, and thousands of additional mines to the defensive arc that the Tiger battalions would eventually have to penetrate. The delays were justified, each time, partly in terms of giving the new armored vehicles more preparation time, more Tigers reaching their units, more Panthers being worked up at their training grounds, more of the Ferdinand tank destroyers being fitted out at their assembly facilities. The logic was self-consistent on its face. Germany had chosen to stake the operation's success on its newest and most capable armored vehicles. Therefore, the operation should wait until those vehicles were ready. What this logic failed to interrogate was whether waiting was cost-free, whether the 6-week, 8-week, 12-week delay being granted to German armored preparation was also being spent by the Soviet defenders. It was. Every week that German planners waited for more Tigers, Soviet engineers were laying more mines. The ratio of preparation being exchanged was not 1-to-1. The Red Army was getting substantially more from the delay than the Wehrmacht. By the 5th of July, 1943, the morning the operation actually began, Germany had concentrated approximately 147 Tiger Is for Citadel. This was the largest single Tiger concentration of the entire war, assembled across two attacking army groups in the north and south of the salient. The Southern Attack Force, under Army Group South, included the 2nd SS Panzer Corps with its 3 divisions, Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, and Totenkopf, each equipped with a Tiger company. The Northern Force under Army Group Center was weaker in Tigers, but included the battalion attached to the 9th Army. How many of those 147 were genuinely operational on the morning of the 5th? The German figure of 133 operational is drawn from the OKH morning report. The Soviet intelligence assessment of 68% operational readiness implies something closer to 100 to 110. I've looked at both figures carefully, and I think the Soviet estimate is probably closer to the combat effective truth, precisely because the maintenance history of every Tiger unit committed to Citadel shows vehicles that had been pushed hard during the approach march and were carrying accumulated mechanical stress into the opening of the operation. The Tiger companies performed, in the opening days of Citadel, approximately as their tactical doctrine intended. Long-range engagement, identifying Soviet armor at distances that exceeded the effective range of Soviet anti-tank guns, engaging from hull-down positions where possible, using the KWK-36's range advantage to destroy targets before those targets could effectively respond. Kill ratios in specific engagements approached and exceeded 5-to-1. Individual Tiger vehicles chalked up multiple kills in single actions. The tactical performance was real, and it was documented in after-action reports, whose figures, while certainly subject to the overcounting that characterizes all armored combat assessments, reflect genuine tactical effectiveness. This is important to acknowledge, because the argument this documentary is making is not that the Tiger was tactically ineffective. The argument is that tactical effectiveness, even at those ratios, could not bridge the strategic gap. And Citadel was the moment that gap was measured against the hardest available evidence. The Soviet defensive architecture at Kursk was organized around a principle that specifically countered the Tiger's greatest asset: anti-tank strongpoints. The Soviet protivo-tankovye opornye punkty consisted of 4 to 6 guns in mutually supporting positions, pre-registered on specific terrain features, connected by field telephone wire, and positioned in depth across multiple successive lines. A Tiger attacking one gun position brought itself into the firing arc of 2 others. The first line of Soviet anti-tank defense was positioned at ranges of approximately 1,500 meters or more, inside the Tiger's effective engagement range, but at distances where the Tiger's gun advantage was real. The second and third lines were positioned at 400 to 800 meters, close enough for Soviet guns to engage Tiger side armor, which was 80 millimeters, compared to the frontal 100 millimeter plate. The defensive geometry had been built specifically around the Tiger's capabilities. German after-action reports noted, with visible alarm, that the Soviet defenses seemed to be anticipating exactly the Tiger's tactical approach. The 12th of July, 1943, produced the engagement most associated with Kursk in popular memory, the armored clash near Prokhorovka, in the southern sector, where the 2nd SS Panzer Corps met the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army in a battle whose scale and significance have been argued about ever since. The contemporary German accounts described a major Soviet defeat, enormous Soviet losses, multiple Tiger kills, tactical success. Later historical analysis, particularly the detailed work by Nicholas Zetterling and Anders Frankson published in 2000, and significantly revised the picture, concluding that Soviet armored losses in the immediate engagement were indeed heavy, but that German forces failed entirely to achieve the operational breakthrough the plan required. Tigers destroyed more Soviet tanks than Soviet tanks destroyed Tigers on that day. The operation failed anyway. That's the Prokhorovka lesson that matters. On the 13th of July, 2 days after the Allied landing in Sicily, Hitler summoned his senior commanders and announced the suspension of Operation Citadel. The Sicily landing provided the formal justification. Forces were needed in the Mediterranean theater. The southern flank was threatened. The offensive in Russia had to yield resources. The operational situation on the 13th of July provided the real one. The German advance in the south of the salient had stalled short of its objectives after 8 days of fighting that had consumed irreplaceable armored strength, fuel reserves, and ammunition stocks. The Tigers had performed well. The operation had failed. When I look at the OKH War Diary entry for the 13th of July, the entry that records the halt of Germany's last strategic offensive initiative on the Eastern Front, I'm struck every time by its brevity. 3 lines. 3 lines to record the moment when Germany permanently surrendered the strategic initiative in the East. The institution's capacity to compress catastrophe into administrative language is, in its own way, remarkable. The fuel and ammunition expenditure during Citadel's 9 days of major fighting represents, in retrospect, a strategic watershed that the German High Command never fully acknowledged. Approximately 100,000 metric tons of fuel across all formations committed to the operation, 27,000 metric tons of artillery ammunition, irreplaceable reserves of the men and machines that had been accumulated through months of careful preparation. When the operation halted, those reserves were gone. Germany would never again accumulate the armored strength required for a major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. The Tigers at Kursk had achieved their tactical missions with considerable skill, and in the narrow sense, considerable success. What they hadn't achieved was the breakthrough the plan required. And after Citadel, the question of what Tigers were for had a different answer than it had had in May. They were for defense, and they had been built for something else. The mines deserve a paragraph, because they're one of those factors that the dramatic narrative of tank versus tank combat tends to overshadow. The Kursk defensive arc contained approximately 500,000 anti-tank mines and approximately 440,000 anti-personnel mines, the densest mine defensive position in the history of warfare to that point. These were not sophisticated devices. Many were wooden-boxed T-mine 35s and their derivatives, simple pressure plate mechanisms that cost roughly 10 Reichsmarks each. A Tiger cost 250,000 Reichsmarks. In the minefields around Kursk, a 10 Reichsmark mine could immobilize a 250,000 Reichsmark Tiger by destroying a track, stranding the vehicle while its crew attempted field repairs under fire, consuming a recovery vehicle to extract it, and removing it from the operational order of battle for anywhere from 24 hours to several weeks. The arithmetic of that exchange was one that German procurement planners had never modeled and never publicly addressed. Chapter 8. The ACE Problem. When individual genius masks systemic failure. Somewhere in the Bundesarchive's NS-19 series, the collection of Waffen-SS administrative and propaganda documents, there is a press release typed on onion skin paper with the double lightning bolt letterhead. It announces a promotion, a decoration, a name. Michael Whitman, summer of 1944. The decoration is the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of the highest combat decorations in the German military system. In the margin of this particular copy, someone has written a single word in pencil. Genug? Enough? Whether that word was written by a propaganda officer, checking whether the release covered the required material, or by someone with a more sardonic cast of mind, has never been determined. The pencil mark survived the war. The press release survived the war. The man it celebrated did not. Michael Wittmann was born in Bavaria in April of 1914, joined the Waffen-SS in 1936, and spent the early part of the war commanding assault guns before transitioning to Tiger tanks in early 1943. His service on the Eastern Front through 1943 was genuinely remarkable by any measurable standard of armored combat performance. Historian Steven Zaloga, in his careful analytical work on armored effectiveness, credits Wittmann with approximately 135 tank kills across his career, with approximately 120 of those achieved in 1943 on the Eastern Front, many of them while operating a Sturmgeschütz assault gun rather than a Tiger. That distinction between assault gun kills and Tiger kills matters, and the Reich's propaganda apparatus did not maintain it. Wittmann's reputation was built on everything he had ever destroyed, bundled together and attached to the Tiger brand. The specific vehicle was less important than the legend the vehicle needed. The 13th of June, 1944, is the date most permanently associated with Wittmann's name. Villers-Bocage, Normandy, a Norman market town on a road that, if the British 7th Armored Division had secured it, would have opened a route around the German defensive flank west of Caen. Wittmann's Tiger, hull number 007 of the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, was positioned on a ridge above the town road when elements of the 7th Armored began moving through. What happened in the next 15 to 20 minutes has been described and re-described so many times that separating the event from its accretion of legend requires considerable patience. The British after-action reports from the 7th Armored Division and the German War Diary of the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion agree on the basic facts. Wittmann's vehicle and a small number of accompanying tanks engaged a column of British armor and transport vehicles on the road below, destroyed between 11 and 14 tanks and approximately 15 armored personnel carriers, and temporarily halted the British advance. The propaganda made it a legend. The operational reality was more conditional. What the propaganda did not broadcast was that Wittmann's own Tiger was disabled and abandoned during the action, the crew escaping on foot. The British withdrew from Villers-Bocage, but they were not permanently stopped. The tactical delay measured in days, not weeks. Within the broader context of the Normandy campaign, the engagement at Villers-Bocage was an impressive tactical action that had no strategic consequence. The British eventually bypassed the position. The German defensive line in Normandy contracted regardless. Wittmann's 15 minutes of extraordinary combat skill, and they were extraordinary, that much is honest, had been converted by the machinery of Reich propaganda into evidence that the Tiger could hold back the tide. It couldn't. But the legend was more useful than the truth. The propaganda investment in individual Tiger aces produced a secondary effect within the Wehrmacht that field commanders were beginning to document by the autumn of 1943. The Bundesarchive holds a number of unit history documents and commanders' assessments from this period. I want to be careful not to overstate the uniformity of what they say, because the records are fragmentary, but a pattern does emerge across multiple accounts. Tiger vehicle commanders taking deliberate tactical risks to accumulate kill scores that would merit recognition, committing their vehicles in ones and twos to actions that doctrine would require a company-level force to execute. The machinery of military celebrity was, in a specific and measurable sense, getting Tigers destroyed. The myth was consuming the machines it depended on. Bobby Wool's post-war testimony is the detail I keep returning to when the Wittmann legend is invoked. Wool was Wittmann's gunner for the majority of his Eastern Front service, and his account, documented in Patrick Agda's research, is notable for its deliberate deflation of individual genius mythology. The kills, Wool said, came from the sight, from the Zeiss TZF-9B's range estimation reticles, from the 5x magnification that let a trained gunner identify and range a target at 1,500 meters before that target's crew had any idea they were being engaged. You simply had to not be afraid to shoot. That sentence is not modesty, it's a technical assessment. The sight showed you the information. The courage to act on it was necessary, but it wasn't sufficient. The gun's lethality was a product of the optical system, as much as the man behind it. The Reich built a legend about a man. The operational reality was a legend about a piece of Zeiss glass. The 8th of August, 1944, near the village of Saint-Thô in Normandy, during Operation Totalize, the Canadian and British armored assault aimed at breaking through the German defenses south of Caen. Whitman's Tiger was destroyed. The means of destruction is, as of the most current historical analysis, genuinely unresolved. A Sherman Firefly of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry has the most credible claim. The penetration pattern on the surviving photographic evidence of the destroyed Tiger is consistent with a high-velocity sabot round. Canadian armor records document an M4 Sherman engaging a Tiger in the same area. Royal Air Force ground attack sortie records document a mission in the same vicinity at approximately the same time. 3 separate Allied assets, each with documentary support for their claim. Whitman's body was not recovered or identified until 1983, when construction work near Saint-Thô uncovered the remains of his crew. The Reich's greatest individual Tiger achievement ended in a confused engagement from multiple unknown directions, killed by an adversary who, depending on which account you accept, may not have known who they were shooting at. The SD Sicherheitsdienst Mood reports, the Reich Security Service's regular assessments of civilian morale, document the propaganda effect of the Tiger Ace narrative with some precision. In the period from mid-1943 through the spring of 1944, the SD reports note that public awareness of Tiger victories and named Tiger commanders was reliably associated with short-term improvements in civilian morale, particularly in industrial and urban areas where the general war news was uniformly bad. The propaganda worked. It produced the psychological outcome it was designed to produce. The problem, and this is the problem that no propaganda system can ultimately solve, was that the morale it generated was predicated on an expectation that the Tiger would turn the war's direction. The expectation was wrong. When it failed to materialize, the morale debt it had created had to be paid. Whitman's official career kill total of 138 tanks represented, at the time of his death in August of 1944, approximately 0.24% of total Soviet tank production up to that date. That number isn't a diminishment, it's a structural fact about the nature of industrial warfare. Individual excellence, no matter how genuine, cannot accumulate at the rate that a factory can accumulate mediocrity. Germany's military culture had been built, across decades, around the concept of Auftragstaktik, mission tactics, the principle that individual initiative and superior tactical judgment could overcome numerical disadvantage. It was a doctrine that had produced extraordinary results in Poland, in France, in the early stages of Barbarossa. Against an adversary who was producing 1,300 tanks a month, it was a doctrine that had reached the limit of what tactical genius could accomplish. The Tiger was the most expensive expression of that limit. Chapter 9. The Elephant and the Mouse, when more Tiger became a religion. There is a staff officer's evaluation in the OKW weapons development file, Bundesarchiv RH8/V1212, that contains what I consider the most economically efficient summary of German armored procurement pathology ever committed to paper. The document is an internal review of the Maus prototype, the Panzerkampfwagen VIII, Ferdinand Porsche's super heavy tank design, weighing approximately 188 tons, mounting a 128mm gun, capable of a maximum road speed of approximately 20 kilometers per hour. The staff officer's handwritten annotation asks 2 words: Brückenklasse? Bridge classification? A different hand has written the answer beneath it: keine, none. A 188-ton vehicle, designed to defend the Reich, suitable for no bridge in Europe, without specialized engineering preparation. Someone thought this was ready for production. It is worth sitting with that fact for a moment. The Ferdinand, later renamed the Elephant, arrived at Kursk as the direct consequence of a procurement decision made in the wrong direction. When the Henschel design won the Tiger contract and the Porsche VK 45.01P lost, Ferdinand Porsche had already partially completed 91 hulls on his production line. The hulls existed. The copper for the electric drive transmission had already been ordered and consumed. The shortage that would affect German ammunition production in 1943 was already locked in. Rather than scrap the hulls, the decision was made to convert them into heavy tank destroyers, mounting the 88mm Pak 43 in a fixed superstructure. The result was the Ferdinand, a vehicle with genuinely formidable firepower, adequate armor protection, and one critical omission that an inspection process functioning at any level of operational rigor should have flagged immediately. It had no hull machine gun, no close-range defensive weapon of any kind. The designers had assessed that a vehicle operating at long range against enemy armor would not need close-range infantry defense. The 5th of July, 1943. The Ferdinands deployed at Kursk with the Schwere Panzerjäger Regiment 656 in the northern sector of the offensive under Army Group Center. Their long-range anti-tank performance was, by the standards of the vehicle's design parameters, effective. They destroyed significant numbers of Soviet armored vehicles at distances that put the Ferdinand's own armor beyond the effective reach of most Soviet anti-tank guns. And then, the Soviet infantry found the gap. The absence of a whole machine gun, the design decision that had seemed acceptable in the planning room, became, in the broken terrain of the Kursk defensive arc, where Soviet infantry moved through anti-tank ditches and ravines, a catastrophic vulnerability. Soldiers carrying Molotov cocktails and explosive satchel charges could approach a Ferdinand from angles the vehicle couldn't cover, and attack it at close range without the crew having any effective response. Of the 91 Ferdinands committed to Citadel, approximately 39 were destroyed or disabled during the operation, with a substantial proportion of those losses attributable not to tank-on-tank combat, but to infantry close assault and mine damage. The German unit records attribute most of the losses to mines. The Soviet after-action reports emphasize the infantry assault successes. The photographic evidence. Soviet photographers documented multiple destroyed Ferdinands at close range, is consistent with the Soviet account. A weapon system that cost more to build than a standard Tiger, deployed to counter a threat its designers had anticipated, was being destroyed by men with bottles of petrol. The Maus program occupies a different category of institutional failure from the Ferdinand. The Ferdinand was a mistake born of waste-not frugality, using existing hulls rather than scrapping them, a procurement impulse that is at least comprehensible. The Maus was a mistake born of what I can only describe as a form of engineering solipsism, the pursuit of technical superlatives so divorced from operational context that the question of whether the vehicle could actually be deployed to a battlefield appears to have been genuinely secondary to the question of whether it could be built. 188 tons. A 128mm gun capable of defeating any armor plate in existence. A maximum road speed of 20 kilometers per hour. A range of approximately 160 kilometers. Insufficient to traverse Germany's longest operational axis without refueling multiple times, in a period when German fuel production was collapsing under Allied bombing, and no bridge in Europe capable of bearing its weight without engineering preparation, that, in any contested operational environment, was essentially impossible to provide. Ferdinand Porsche's propulsion solution for the Maus reprised the electric drive principle that had failed in the original Tiger competition. A Daimler-Benz aircraft engine, derived from the DB603 power plant used in the Messerschmitt 410, connected to a generator that powered electric motors on each track. The system produced approximately 1,200 horsepower, impressive in absolute terms, catastrophic when divided by 188 tons. The power-to-weight ratio was approximately 6.5 horsepower per ton. The Tiger I, already considered severely underpowered, achieved 12.3 horsepower per ton. The Maus was operating at approximately half the Tiger's already inadequate power-to-weight ratio. It could, theoretically, ford rivers up to 8 meters deep using an underwater breathing system, provided a second Maus was standing on the bank to supply electrical power through a cable. This procedure required approximately 30 minutes of preparation. The logistics of two 188-ton vehicles, coordinating a river crossing, were never successfully demonstrated. Hitler's personal engagement with super-heavy tank designs in the 1943-44 period is documented in the Speer Ministry meeting transcripts with a specificity that is, in retrospect, difficult to read without a kind of compressive dismay. Albert Speer's post-war testimony, given at Nuremberg and partially reproduced in his memoir, describes Hitler spending extended time during armaments review meetings with scale models of the Maus and the projected E-series super-heavy designs, moving them across tabletop maps and discussing their theoretical capabilities while the armaments ministers waited. Speer calculated, for the relevant meeting, that producing 100 Maus vehicles would consume the steel allocation of approximately 1,400 Panzer IVs. The calculation was presented. No formal objection was filed. In the meeting transcripts, the two things, the scale models and the steel calculation, appear to have occupied different registers of attention. The copper shortage connection between the original Porsche Tiger failure and the Maus program is one of those archival threads that runs through multiple document collections without ever being made explicit in a single source, which means I want to be careful about how I present it. What the records show clearly is this. Porsche's pre-competition copper procurement for the Tiger's electric drive transmission created a documented shortage in German copper reserves in 1942. The Maus's generator system required substantial copper wiring for its electrical windings. German copper allocation records from 1943 and 1944 document constraints on electrical component production that affected multiple programs simultaneously. Whether the Maus program specifically was impaired by the copper shortage that Porsche's earlier procurement gamble created, I cannot state as a direct causal chain from a single document. What I can say is that the same man who created the shortage was the designer of the system that needed the copper, and the timeline is consistent. Some historical inferences are more probable than others. The two Maus prototypes were discovered by American ordnance investigators at the Kummersdorf Proving Ground in the spring of 1945. Both had been destroyed by their own crews before Allied forces arrived. One had a functional drivetrain. The other had a functional turret. Neither had both systems working simultaneously. The crews, according to the evidence at the site, had attempted to combine working components from the two vehicles before destroying them. They had failed to complete the combination. They had then detonated both. 188 tons of engineering ambition, twice over, blown up in a German field by the men who had been trying to make it work. The largest single armored vehicle ever constructed in Europe, designed to defend the Reich, built to prove German engineering supremacy, capable of crossing no bridge in the continent it was built to save, ended as two craters and a proving ground that American soldiers had reached before any Maus ever reached a battlefield. Chapter 10. The Man Who Tried to Stop It. Guderian's War Within a War. The 3rd of September, 1943. 7 pages. That's the length of the memorandum that General Heinz Guderian sent to OKH, Bundesarchiv RH10/62, following the failure of Operation Citadel and the first clear signs of the strategic reversal on the Eastern Front. 7 pages of measured, precise, technical argument. The document covers production ratios, mechanical failure rates, operational readiness statistics from the Kursk campaign, and a comparative assessment of German versus Soviet armored output projections. On page 4, the final paragraph makes the core recommendation with the clarity of a man who knows he's right and suspects it won't matter. The further production of the Tiger at the expense of the Panzer IV must be reconsidered in light of the operational evidence from Citadel. We cannot afford to substitute quality for quantity when the quantity ratio against us is already fatal. The memo was received. It was logged. No response appears in the archive. Not a rejection, not an acknowledgement. Silence, which in the Wehrmacht of the autumn of 1943 was itself a form of institutional decision. Guderian's position in the German military hierarchy by the autumn of 1943 was theoretically powerful and practically constrained in ways that the formal title, Inspector General of Armored Forces, didn't reveal. He had been reinstated to active duty in February of 1943, after roughly 18 months of professional exile, appointed to a newly created position with an expansive-sounding mandate: rationalize Germany's armored vehicle program, improve operational readiness, modernize doctrine. His access to Hitler was real. His ability to present technical arguments and production analyses to the Supreme Command was genuine. What he lacked, what no officer in the Wehrmacht of 1943 could possess, regardless of rank or competence, was the institutional authority to override a decision in which Hitler had a personal interest. The Tiger program was, by 1943, a personal commitment of the Führer. No memo, however carefully reasoned, could navigate around that fact. His specific objections to Citadel's timing have been presented, in the popular literature, largely through the lens of his own memoir, Panzerleader, published in German in 1950 and translated into English the same year. The memoir presents Guderian as consistently prescient, consistently overruled, consistently vindicated by subsequent events. Historian David Stahel, in his careful archival research on the German campaigns in Russia, has documented several instances where Guderian's memoir significantly revises his wartime positions to make them appear more consistent and more far-sighted than the contemporary documents support. This is worth acknowledging directly because it complicates the hagiographic narrative. Guderian was not always right. He was not always consistent. But on the specific question of Tiger production economics and the unsustainability of Germany's heavy tank procurement priorities, the archival record broadly supports his position. Not because he said so in his memoir, but because the production figures and maintenance failure rates said so independently. The post-Citadel assessment documents are, to me, the most significant records of Guderian's institutional campaign against the super heavy tank program. His recommendations in the summer and autumn of 1943 were specific, technically grounded, and entirely consistent with what subsequent military economic analysis would validate. Halt Tiger II development and redirect resources to Panzer IV production. Increase spare parts allocation to the field units by approximately 40%, a figure drawn from the gap between what maintenance crews were requesting and what the supply system was delivering. Suspend all work on vehicles exceeding 50 tons. These were not dramatic proposals. They were engineering budget management, applied to a national armaments program that was behaving like an engineering budget that had never been managed. Every recommendation was sound. None was implemented. The meeting transcripts that Speer preserved in his post-war testimony describe a scene that recurs through the autumn of 1943 and into 1944 with grim consistency. Guderian presents numbers. Hitler presents scale models. The numbers and the models occupy different epistemological registers. One is a description of what is, the other is a vision of what might be. And in the command culture of the Third Reich, the vision consistently outweighed the description. Speer documents Hitler explicitly rejecting the proposal to halt Tiger II production in favor of Panzer IV output, on grounds that the Panzer IV was adequate but, in the specific phrase that Speer records in his testimony, not German enough for the war's final phase. I have read that phrase multiple times, and I am still not entirely sure what it means in operational terms. I think it means that the Tiger program had become, by this stage, more about what Germany believed itself to be than about what Germany needed to win. Those are different objectives, and confusing them is a particular kind of institutional catastrophe. The Panther's parallel story reinforces the pattern. Guderian's specific technical objection to the Panther's deployment at Citadel, an objection he raised in the February and March planning meetings of 1943, was grounded in his understanding of fatigue cycling in the suspension arms. The early production Panther's Schwingarme, the swing arm suspension components, were experiencing metal fatigue failures after as few as 400 kilometers of operational use. Guderian had the data from the training grounds. He projected, with reasonable accuracy, that Panthers committed to a major offensive before this problem was resolved would suffer catastrophic suspension failures during high-tempo operations. His projection for the failure rate at Kursk was, as the operational records confirm, conservative. The Panthers committed to Citadel lost approximately 160 vehicles in the first 4 days of the operation, a substantial portion of those losses attributable to mechanical failure rather than enemy action. Guderian was right about this specific technical point, and the documentation supports him, and the operation proceeded anyway. His dismissal in March of 1945 was, by the account of multiple witnesses, the kind of scene that the Wehrmacht's carefully maintained institutional dignity had been trying to prevent for years. By then, Guderian was chief of the Army General Staff, a different and more powerful position than his earlier Inspector General role. And the argument that ended his career was about the disposition of Germany's remaining armored reserves. He wanted concentration and depth. Hitler wanted dispersion across multiple threatened fronts. The meeting, according to accounts from officers present, ended with Hitler shouting. Guderian cleared his desk the same afternoon. He had been right about the Tiger's economics in September of 1943. He had been right about the Panther's fatigue failures in March of that year. He had been right, repeatedly and in detail, about the specific technical and logistical failures that were destroying Germany's armored forces. Being right, in the Wehrmacht of the final years, carried no institutional protection whatsoever. The sequence of dates in the Bundesarchiv file is the detail that I find most revealing about the nature of Guderian's institutional impotence. His September 1943 memorandum, objecting to Tiger II development, was filed with OKH on the 3rd of September. Immediately following it in the archive, the subsequent document, filed 3 days earlier, is the finalized Tiger II production schedule. His objections arrived after the decision they objected to had already been enacted. The channels through which Guderian had formal influence had been bypassed before he began using them. The memo wasn't rejected. It simply arrived in an archive next to a decision that had already been made, 3 days before the memo was written, by a process that hadn't consulted him. That filing sequence, 2 date stamps in a folder, is a more precise description of the Wehrmacht's command dysfunction than any battle map. The modern defense procurement literature has a term for the institutional pattern that Guderian experienced: expert marginalization in requirements governance. It describes the structural tendency of large organizations, military and civilian, to create formal channels for technical expertise, while simultaneously creating informal decision pathways that bypass those channels whenever technical assessments conflict with executive preferences. The U.S. Defense Acquisition University, in its case study curriculum on procurement failure, uses the Tiger program as a primary historical example of this dynamic. I find that institutional continuity both reassuring and depressing. Reassuring because it means we've identified the pattern. Depressing because the identification hasn't prevented recurrence. The September memorandum's final paragraph, the one that describes the quantity ratio as already fatal, is, in retrospect, one of the most precisely accurate strategic assessments produced by any German officer of the war's middle period. The ratio was already fatal. Germany was producing 104 Tigers in its best month, against a Soviet output of over 1,000 T-34s per month. No tactical doctrine, no individual ace, no incremental improvement in vehicle performance could bridge that gap. Guderian knew it. He said it. He wrote it down. He filed it in the correct institutional channel, and the archive records the response in the form of an empty column where a reply should be. Chapter 11. The View from the Other Side. What the Soviets Actually Saw. The 17th of February, 1943. A document bearing 3 separate top-secret stamps, Soviet classification markings, moves through the analysis division of the WW2, the main armored forces directorate of the Red Army. Its reference is a technical intelligence report numbered 4763, classified as highest secret, now held in the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense of Russia at Podolsk. The cover page carries a handwritten notation from the receiving officer. Ważno dla leta, important for the summer, written in February, 4 months before the largest tank battle in history. Someone in the Soviet military system had already read the Tiger's technical profile carefully enough to understand what the summer would require. The report's existence was the direct consequence of a capture that had occurred roughly 3 weeks earlier on the Leningrad front near the settlement of Maga, the same area where the Tiger had made its catastrophic debut in August of 1942. Soviet forces of the 67th Army managed to surround and capture a Tiger, one of the 502nd Heavy Panzer Battalion, later designated Tiger 100 by Soviet documentation, in a state sufficiently intact for technical evaluation. Unlike the British capture of Tiger 131 in Tunisia 2 months later, which generated considerable publicity and a carefully staged inspection tour, the Soviet response was quiet, systematic, and immediately operational. There were no photographs released, no propaganda announcements. The vehicle was disassembled. Its components were measured, weighed, cross-sectioned, and tested. Within 3 weeks, WW2 had a technical report. Within 4 months, that report's recommendations had been incorporated into the defensive planning for the Kursk salient. The report's accuracy, measured against what we now know from German sources, is striking. The Tiger's frontal armor thickness of 100 millimeters was correctly identified. The side armor of 80 millimeters at near vertical angles was correctly identified as the vehicle's primary vulnerability. The final drive unit's construction was assessed with sufficient detail to identify its maintenance intensity. The assessment recommended the 57 millimeter ZIS-2 anti-tank gun as an effective flanking weapon against Tiger side armor at ranges under 300 meters, a recommendation that was correct, and that the German after-action reports from Kursk would later confirm with considerable alarm. The Soviets produced an accurate technical assessment of Germany's most capable weapon 3 weeks after capturing one. Germany never produced an equivalent systematic analysis of the T-34's production economics and tactical counters. The asymmetry and institutional rigor is itself a primary source. The question of how systematically these intelligence assessments were translated into operational practice at Kursk is one where Soviet and Russian historians have disagreed in ways that I find genuinely interesting, rather than merely academic. The operational planning documents for the Kursk defense, partially declassified and available through Glantz's research, show anti-tank gun positioning that accounts for the Tiger's maximum engagement range. First defensive lines at approximately 1,500 meters spacing, second lines at 400 meters designed for flank engagement as vehicles penetrated the first line. This suggests the WW2 recommendations were operationally implemented, at least at the level of defensive architecture. Russian military historian Mikhail Baryatinsky has argued that the implementation was inconsistent, that many lower-level Soviet commanders defaulted to standard doctrine rather than the Tiger-specific adaptations, and he cites unit-level operational reports that show engagement distances and gun deployment patterns inconsistent with Tiger-specific doctrine. Both positions have documentary support. The truth was probably somewhere between full implementation and negligible impact, significant enough to affect the battle's outcome, inconsistent enough that specific units on specific days weren't following the playbook. What is not in doubt is the developmental response. Following the WW2 technical assessment of the captured Tiger, the Soviet NIIBT Tank Testing Institute conducted live-fire trials against captured Tiger armor components. The results fed directly into an accelerated development program for a new tank gun capable of defeating Tiger frontal armor at combat ranges, a project that produced the 85mm D5T gun, mounted in a redesigned turret on the existing T-34 hull, entering mass production in the spring of 1944 as the T-34-85. The development timeline from Tiger capture to T-34-85 deployment is approximately 15 months. Germany's production and development system had no equivalent adaptive capacity, no mechanism by which the tactical experience of fighting the T-34 could be converted into a modified production specification within anything approaching that timeline. The Soviets captured one Tiger, analyzed it, and built the weapon that defeated it in 15 months. Germany spent those 15 months producing more Tigers. The T-34-85's gun performance figures deserve specific attention because they reframe the Tiger's period of genuine tactical superiority with some precision. The 85mm ZISS-53 gun could penetrate 111mm of vertical armor plate at 500 meters and approximately 102mm at 1,000 meters. Tiger I frontal hull armor was 100mm. Tiger I frontal turret armor was 100mm. The T-34-85 could defeat Tiger frontal armor at under 500 meters, and Tiger side armor, 80mm, at over 1,000 meters. It couldn't engage Tigers with impunity at long range, but it could engage them. And given the production ratio of approximately 12 T-34-85s produced for every Tiger I or Tiger II built in the same period, tactical parity at 500 meters was strategically transformative. The Tiger's window of genuine technological superiority, from its introduction in August of 1942 until the T-34-85 entered mass production in the spring of 1944, was approximately 20 months. Germany built its strategic doctrine on a 20-month advantage. The Soviet approach to fighting Tigers at Kursk, documented in training materials produced in late 1943, included a close-range tactic that reflects a tactical intelligence the German sources treat with considerable unease. Anti-tank rifle teams, armed with the PTRS or PTRD 14.5mm anti-tank rifles, which could not penetrate Tiger hull armor, but could penetrate the Tiger's road wheels, were instructed to target the interleaved wheel system specifically. The WW2 assessment of the captured Tiger 100 had identified that removing a single middle wheel from an interleaved row would jam the remaining wheels against each other, immobilizing the vehicle without requiring penetration of its main armor. The anti-tank rifle round, which the vehicle's main armor was entirely proof against, could defeat the road wheel disc, a much less protected component, at ranges under 200 meters. German unit reports from Kursk note this tactic with the specific alarm of professionals encountering something they had not modeled. The Tiger's most elaborate engineering, the very system designed to distribute its weight across soft terrain, had been identified as an improvised vehicle stopper by the people it was supposed to be stopping. The ZIS 257mm anti-tank gun deserves its own paragraph, because it's one of those weapons that the dramatic narrative of Kursk tends to bury beneath the more visually spectacular T-34 engagements. The ZIS 2 had been developed in 1941 as a response to anticipated German heavy tank development, then temporarily halted in production when the threat materialized more slowly than expected, then restarted in 1943 when the Tiger appeared. It fired a high-velocity round capable of penetrating Tiger I side armor at approximately 1,000 meters, substantially beyond the engagement range that the Tiger's crews had been trained to consider safe from Soviet anti-tank guns. The ZIS 2 was deployed specifically in the second and third lines of the Kursk defense, positioned to engage tanks that had survived the first line and were moving forward with reduced vigilance about their flanks. German after-action reports mention the 76mm gun and the 85mm gun frequently. The ZIS-2 appears less often. The statistical implication that survivors of ZIS-2 engagements were fewer is uncomfortable and probably accurate. What strikes me most, working through the Soviet intelligence files from this period, is a quality that has no precise single word in English, a kind of professional dispassion in the assessments that contrasts sharply with the German propaganda materials from the same months. The GABTU technical report on the captured Tiger is not triumphalist. It doesn't describe the Tiger as something to be feared. It describes it as a problem to be solved, in the specific technical language of engineers who have measured a thing and are now deciding how to counter it. There's no rhetoric, no invocation of historical stakes, no appeal to national sentiment. There's armor thickness in millimeters, penetration data at specific ranges, vulnerability assessments organized by engagement geometry. The contrast with the German Wochenschau footage of invincible Tiger advances, filmed at careful angles to maximize visual impact, is almost archaeological. Two military systems responding to the same vehicle, one building mythology, one building measurements. The adaptive cycle time is, finally, the metric that I think most cleanly captures the asymmetry. 15 months from Tiger capture to T-34-85 deployment. The Soviet military-industrial system, operating under conditions of enormous strain, factories relocated east of the Urals, workforce disrupted, supply chains stretched across a continent, processed a captured enemy vehicle, designed a counterweapon, and deployed it at mass production scale in 15 months. Modern military analysts studying electronic warfare and drone combat in current conflicts have found adaptation cycles of 4 to 8 weeks for countermeasures to newly encountered systems. The compression from 15 months to 4 weeks is a measure of how warfare's pace has changed. The underlying principle, capture, analyze, counter, deploy, hasn't changed at all. The Soviets applied it to the Tiger in 1943. It remains the most basic cycle of competitive military adaptation. Germany's production system, in 1943 and 44, had no equivalent mechanism. Chapter 12. The Bridge Problem. Infrastructure and the Limits of Power. Spring of 1943. An Army Group South engineering officer sits with a survey map and a pencil, working through a road axis that has been designated for Tiger movement. He marks each bridge crossing with a tick or a cross. Viable without preparation, requires work. He has 47 crossings to evaluate. When he finishes, 3 ticks and 44 crosses stare back at him from the paper. 3 bridges capable of bearing a 57-ton vehicle without engineering preparation. 44 that aren't. The report he files, Bundesarchiv RH 37/6411, concludes that preparing the route for Tiger movement will require 2 pioneer engineering companies, working for approximately 72 hours. He doesn't write anything about whether those 2 companies were available, or what else they might otherwise have been doing, or how many other routes across the same sector were waiting for similar preparation. He simply records the answer to the question he was asked. The implications of that answer are left, silently, for whoever reads it next. The Tiger's weight was, in a very precise engineering sense, the vehicle's most consequential characteristic, more consequential, in the long run, than its gun or its armor, because the gun and the armor operated in specific tactical contexts, while the weight operated everywhere the vehicle existed. Every bridge on every road axis, every railway flat car loading platform, every river crossing, every autobahn overpass. The vehicle's tactical capabilities were available only to the extent that its weight could be managed, and managing that weight consumed resources. Pioneer companies, Sims 80 flat cars, FAMO half-tracks, engineering preparation time, that were finite and competed against every other military priority in every theater where Tigers were deployed. The standard Wehrmacht bridge classification system, Brückenklasse, rated bridges by the maximum vehicle weight they could sustain. Most Eastern Front river crossings were rated Brückenklasse 24, representing 24 tons. A Tiger I at 57 tons exceeded that rating by a factor of roughly 2.4. Standard military bridging equipment, the Brückengerät B, could be configured to span gaps at Brückenklasse 60, with 2 full bridging sets and approximately 2 hours of preparation by a trained pioneer company. Every Tiger unit crossing a river required that preparation at every river crossing. In an operational environment with multiple river obstacles, and the Eastern Front's geography is defined by rivers, from the Dnieper to the Vistula to the Oder, Tiger Battalion movement was a continuous engineering project, consuming resources whose absence was felt everywhere else along the front. The railway constraint was, if anything, more strategically significant than the bridge problem. The Sims 80, the specialized wide-load flat car required for Tiger transport, was a relatively rare piece of rolling stock. The Reichsbahn's operational inventory of these cars peaked at approximately 60 examples during the war's middle period. 60 flat cars. Each Tiger occupied 1 flat car. 1 full Tiger battalion, 45 vehicles, in nominal strength, required 45 flat cars plus additional cars for support vehicles and equipment. Germany never had sufficient Sims 80 inventory to move more than 1 Tiger battalion by rail simultaneously. With 4, 6, 8 Tiger battalions eventually in service across multiple fronts, the theoretical ability to rapidly redeploy heavy armor from one threatened sector to another, the strategic reserve function that heavy tanks are supposed to serve, was constrained by a railway flat car inventory that had never been built up to meet the demand the Tiger program was creating. The track swap procedure compounded the railway bottleneck. Before a Tiger could be loaded onto in Sims 80, the combat tracks, 725 millimeters wide, had to be removed and replaced with narrower transport tracks that fit within the flat car's gauge constraints. The procedure required approximately 3.5 hours and a team of 6 men working with the correct tools. It had to be performed in reverse at the destination. 7 hours of skilled labor, twice, for each vehicle, for each rail movement. In addition to the flat car availability constraint, the loading and unloading infrastructure requirements, and the locomotive capacity to move a train of heavy flat cars across the German rail network, while simultaneously moving ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, and everything else the Wehrmacht depended on. When the Allied landings in Normandy in June of 1944 created an urgent requirement to redeploy Tiger units from the Eastern Front to France, the rail system's accumulated constraints meant the redeployment was measured in days and weeks rather than hours. Normandy presented the infrastructure problem in a different form. The Norman bocages' sunken lanes were built over centuries of agricultural use. They were designed for ox carts, then horse-drawn wagons, then rural motor vehicles of perhaps 2 or 3 tons. A Tiger I at 57 tons occupied a lane so completely that the width clearances on each side were measured in centimeters. The vehicles couldn't pass each other in the lanes at all. Meeting a Tiger going the other direction in a bocage lane required one vehicle to reverse until a passing point was found. A maneuver that in a 57-ton vehicle took considerable time and considerable fuel. Rommel's headquarters explicitly restricted Tiger movement on certain road surfaces during daylight hours, both for air defense reasons and because Tiger tracks were destroying the road surfaces that subsequent wheeled traffic required. The vehicle that was supposed to be enabling German tactical flexibility in Normandy was being restricted by the army that owned it to preserve the infrastructure it was consuming. The deep weighting system deserves mention, if only because it represents such a precise example of engineering capability that was operationally useless. Early production Tigers were fitted with a Tauschgerät, an underwater breathing system consisting of a conical snorkel attached to the engine intake and commander's hatch, combined with rubber gaskets sealing all vision ports and a bilge pump for hull leakage. The system allowed the vehicle to drive submerged across rivers up to 4.5 meters deep. Preparation time, approximately 30 minutes. The engineering required to develop and install this system was real and considerable. The operational utility of a 30-minute submersion preparation process during a contested river crossing in an active theater was, in the honest assessment of the vehicle's own operating units, approximately negligible. The system was used in approximately 12 documented operational crossings across the Tiger's entire service life. It absorbed significant development resources and production complexity. It solved a problem that the vehicle's tactical situation almost never presented in the form the system was designed to address. I want to spend a moment with the Autobahn fact, because it sits so specifically at the intersection of the Tiger's engineering achievements and the operational world those achievements couldn't overcome. The German Autobahn network, built partly as a public works program in the 1930s, partly as a genuinely advanced road infrastructure project, and presented by the regime as evidence of German modernity, included bridges and overpasses rated for civilian motor vehicle loads. Standard automotive bridge design of the period typically handled vehicles up to approximately 30 tons with appropriate safety margins. A Tiger I at 57 tons exceeded those margins. During the final defense of the Reich in the spring of 1945, Tiger units attempting to reposition along the Autobahn, the most efficient road network in Germany, were, on multiple documented occasions, unable to cross bridges that their own weight would have destroyed. The vehicle built to defend Germany was too heavy for Germany's roads. That is not a metaphor I've constructed. The engineering records constructed it, and I've simply read them. The Falaise pocket in August of 1944 is where the bridge problem, the fuel problem, and the maneuver problem collapsed simultaneously into a single operational catastrophe for the Tiger units committed to the Normandy campaign. As Allied forces threatened to close the encirclement, Tiger battalions that had spent weeks conducting successful tactical defensive actions found themselves unable to withdraw through available routes, bridges rated below their weight, fuel allocations insufficient for extended movement, road surfaces degraded by months of heavy traffic. Vehicles that couldn't withdraw and couldn't be destroyed efficiently were abandoned. The Tiger units that had tactically dominated parts of the Normandy campaign in June and July were, by August, leaving their vehicles by the road because the infrastructure required to move them no longer existed. The bridge problem, ultimately, wasn't a problem about bridges. It was a problem about a vehicle that had been designed for a kind of war, deliberate, planned, with prepared approaches and organized logistics, that the second half of 1944 conspicuously wasn't providing. Chapter 13. Normandy. The myth meets the firefly. Sometime in June of 1944, the precise date is in the filing records rather than on the document itself, a Royal Armored Corps instruction memo circulated through 21st Army Group headquarters under the heading Tactics for Engaging Heavy Armor. The National Archives holds it at WO285/16. Instruction 4 reads, "The Firefly is not to be used against soft targets or infantry. The Firefly is to be held in reserve until a Tiger or Panther is identified, at which point it is to be committed immediately from a flank or oblique angle. Frontal engagement is not to be attempted except in extremis." 2 sentences, not a recommendation, an order. And encoded in those 2 sentences is everything about the tactical situation in Normandy that the Tiger's designers had wanted to make impossible, and the British Army was now managing with institutional pragmatism. The Sherman Firefly arrived in Normandy at a ratio of 1 vehicle per troop of 4 standard Shermans, 1 per 4. Approximately 342 Fireflies were operational with 21st Army Group by the end of June 1944, distributed across British and Canadian armored regiments in packets of 1, among several less capable vehicles. Its gun was the British 17-pounder, a 76.2mm high-velocity anti-tank weapon, firing an armor-piercing discarding sabot round at approximately 1,200 meters per second muzzle velocity. At 1,000 meters, it could penetrate 187 millimeters of vertical armor plate. Tiger I frontal armor was 100 millimeters, Tiger I's side armor was 80 millimeters. The Firefly could defeat either at any combat range in the Normandy theater. For the first time since the Tiger's introduction 2 years earlier, there was a vehicle in Allied service that could engage a Tiger on approximately equal gunnery terms. Not better terms, not terms that made the Tiger easy, but terms that made it possible. The engineering story behind the Firefly is one of those practical achievements that disappears between the dramatic narratives of combat. The 17-pounder had been developed as a towed anti-tank gun, fighting in that role from Tunisia onward, with considerable effectiveness against Panther and Tiger armor. Mounting it in a tank turret was a different problem. The gun's recoil system required a stroke of approximately 455 millimeters, and the standard Sherman turret had been designed around a weapon with roughly half that recoil length. The engineers at the Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment solved this by relocating the radio set from the turret bustle to the hull, creating the space in the bustle for the 17-pounder's recoil stroke. The modification required a new armored gun mantle, the distinctive ribbed profile that makes a Firefly identifiable at a glance, and reduced the crew from 5 to 4, with the loader working in a significantly cramped space. The conversion work was done at Woolwich Arsenal from late 1943, with the first operational Fireflies reaching units in the spring of 1944. 8 months from concept to deployment in the field. That timeline contrasts instructively with the Tiger's development history. The German response to the Firefly's appearance was both professionally competent and psychologically revealing. Tiger and Panther commanders identified the Firefly's long barrel within weeks of its appearance in Normandy. The standard Sherman 75mm gun had a distinctly shorter barrel profile, making the Firefly visually distinguishable at combat ranges through the Tiger's Zeiss optics. A German instruction memo, documented in British intelligence intercepts of the period, circulated to Tiger and Panther units, warning that the British had introduced a variant of the Sherman with a high-velocity gun, and instructing crews to engage it as a priority target before other Shermans. The instruction was tactically sound. It was also, when you think about it, an admission. Germany's armored forces were now issuing instructions on how to deal specifically with a particular variant of what was supposed to be an inferiorly armed vehicle. The hierarchy of threat had shifted. British armored doctrine for the Firefly's use was explicit about the tactical mathematics it was accepting. The standard engagement approach for a Tiger contact, documented in multiple 21st Army Group training summaries from the Normandy period, involved committing 2 or 3 standard Shermans to engage the Tiger frontally, drawing its fire and occupying its attention, while the Firefly maneuvered to achieve a flank or oblique angle for its killing shot. The Shermans drawing fire were expected to take casualties. This was not a secret. It was written into the doctrine. British tank crews of the period, in accounts collected by Max Hastings and other researchers, refer to this tactic with the informal language of men who've had something difficult explained to them clearly. You go in first, you absorb the shot, you hope the Firefly gets there. The institutional willingness to plan for sacrifice, to build tactical doctrine around the deliberate attrition of specific vehicles and their crews, is one of those facts about the Normandy campaign that sits uncomfortably in the popular memory and needs to be stated directly. The question of who killed Michael Whitman on the 8th of August, 1944, during Operation Totalize near Sinto, is a source conflict that I've mentioned in the outline and want to address honestly here, because it's genuinely unresolved rather than merely ambiguous. The first Northamptonshire Yeomanry's records document a Firefly engagement with a Tiger in the correct location at approximately the correct time, and the penetration evidence on the destroyed Tiger, as analyzed from period photographs, is consistent with a high-velocity sabot round, rather than a standard armor-piercing projectile. This makes the Firefly attribution most probable to my reading of the evidence. Canadian armor records document a Sherman engagement in the same area. Royal Air Force tactical records document a ground attack sortie in the vicinity simultaneously. 3 Allied systems, 3 documentary claims. I think the Firefly killed Whitman. I hold that conclusion provisionally, and I'd want the listener to hold it that way too. The Falaise Pocket's final accounting for Tiger units in Normandy provides the most honest possible measure of what the Tiger had and hadn't achieved in the campaign. In June and July, Tiger companies had inflicted severe casualties on British and Canadian armored formations, held road junctions against significant odds, and delayed Allied operational timelines by days, and in some cases weeks. The kill ratios achieved in specific engagements were real and were impressive. By August, those same Tiger units were abandoning their vehicles in the bocage lanes because they had no fuel, no routes of withdrawal, and no recovery vehicles left to extract the machines. The tactical record from June and July and the operational reality of August are both true simultaneously, and the tension between them is precisely the tension this documentary has been building toward. The Tiger could win every engagement it was designed for. It couldn't change what happened when the engagement was over. The United States Army's decision not to adopt the Firefly is one of those institutional choices whose consequences are documented clearly enough that the choice itself deserves scrutiny. In 1943, British ordnance officials presented the 17-pounder Sherman conversion to their American counterparts, arguing that the existing 75mm gun was inadequate against the Tiger and Panther armor that would be encountered in Northwest Europe. American Army Ordnance declined the conversion, concluding that the 75mm gun was adequate for current threats, and that the 17-pounder installation would disrupt Sherman production schedules. American armored units in Normandy consequently had no equivalent to the Firefly, and their tactical doctrine for engaging Tigers had no equivalent to the one-per-troop specialist vehicle. American tank loss rates in equivalent engagements with Tiger and Panther armor in the summer of 1944 were, by the statistical analysis available in unit records, proportionally higher than British and Canadian rates in similar circumstances. The decision is documented in official U.S. Army Ordnance correspondence. Its consequences are documented in casualty records. The connection between those two sets of documents was not, apparently, made by anyone with the authority to reverse the original decision. The Firefly was not a perfect vehicle. Its ammunition stowage was cramped enough that the loader's working conditions were genuinely difficult. Its conversion's removal of the coaxial machine gun, sacrificed to create space for the 17-pounder's recoil system, reduced the crew's close-range infantry defense capability. It was loud, vibrated substantially, and its distinctive profile meant that German crews quickly learned to identify and prioritize it. But it worked. In the specific tactical context for which it was deployed, as a specialist anti-Tiger and anti-Panther weapon, committed from flanking angles, protected by conventional Shermans absorbing frontal fire, it worked. The Tiger's greatest operational failure in Normandy was not that it was destroyed by a superior weapon, it was that it was sufficiently countered by a good enough weapon deployed in sufficient numbers with the right doctrine, while the Tiger itself continued to be present in numbers far too small to shape the campaign's outcome. Chapter 14. The Fuel Runs Out. Logistics as the Real Battlefield. November of 1944, OKH Rear Services Headquarters. A fuel allocation officer works through the quarterly distribution ledger, column by column, and reaches row 14 in the heavy armor section. Schwere Panzerabteilung 501. Requested, 87,000 liters. Allocated, 12,000 liters. The allocation is approximately 14% of the request. In the margin, initialed but unsigned. Nicht mehr verfügbar, no longer available. Not delayed, not rerouted. Simply, no longer available. The column of numbers below that entry repeats the pattern across multiple units. Request, allocation, gap. Nicht mehr verfügbar. The officer works to the bottom of the page and files the document. There is nothing else to write. To understand what that allocation gap meant in operational practice, you have to hold the Tiger's fuel consumption figures in one hand and Germany's fuel production figures in the other, and let them meet in the arithmetic space between them. A Tiger I consumed approximately 500 liters per 100 kilometers on road surfaces. At full operational tempo, the kind of mobile warfare the Tiger had been designed to conduct, a battalion of 45 vehicles operating cross-country required approximately 360,000 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers of movement. For an operation requiring a penetration of, say, 6 kilometers, the minimum depth required for a tactically meaningful breakthrough, the fuel demand was approximately 216,000 liters for the tank battalion alone, before accounting for the support vehicles, recovery half-tracks, fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and command vehicles that traveled with it. That arithmetic was calculable in 1942. It was simply never placed in the same document as the production projections. Allied bombing of Germany's synthetic fuel infrastructure began in earnest in May of 1944, following a recommendation by American analysts that was initially resisted by the Allied Supreme Command, which preferred railway and airfield targets, before being accepted and implemented with devastating results. The Bergius process hydrogenation plants at Leuna, at Politz, at Bolin produced the majority of Germany's synthetic aviation fuel and a substantial proportion of its vehicle fuel from coal. These facilities were large, fixed, and identifiable from aerial reconnaissance. They were also, once identified as targets, vulnerable in a way that dispersed industries were not. A single successful bombing raid could halt production at a plant for weeks while repair work was completed. German aviation fuel output fell from approximately 175,000 tons per month in April of 1944 to approximately 52,000 tons by September, a reduction of 70% in 5 months. Vehicle fuel followed on a similar trajectory with a slight lag. The Ardennes offensive of December 1944, Operation Wacht am Rhein, was conceived and planned in conditions of fuel shortage that its designers acknowledged and then discounted. The operational plan required the armored spearheads to capture Allied fuel depots in the advance, to sustain the offensive on captured supplies rather than on organic German production. This was not a peripheral assumption. It was a structural requirement of the plan's logistics. If the fuel depots weren't captured quickly enough, or if they'd been moved or destroyed by the time German armor reached them, the offensive would run out of energy before reaching its objectives. This is what happened. Joachim Peiper's battle group, which included Tiger IIs of the 1st SS Panzer Division, advanced approximately 20 kilometers before halting near La Glaise, when fuel reserves were exhausted. The fuel depot Peiper had planned to capture was not where intelligence indicated it would be. His vehicles sat stationary, their engines cooling, while the tactical and operational situation that those engines were supposed to be shaping continued to develop around them. Peiper ordered the abandonment of his vehicles at La Glaise after receiving authorization from divisional headquarters. The Tiger IIs left behind, approximately 60 vehicles of various types, including some of the most capable armored vehicles Germany possessed, were abandoned intact. Their crews departed on foot, carrying small arms and what personal equipment they could manage. The Tiger IIs at La Glaise were not destroyed in combat. They were not knocked out by enemy fire. They simply ran out of fuel in a Belgian field in December, and their crews walked away from them. When American forces reached the site, they found a collection of vehicles that were mechanically sound, some with ammunition still stowed, some with engines that would restart with fresh fuel, simply waiting in the snow. The largest concentration of Tiger IIs to survive a single operation, captured not by military force, but by an empty fuel gauge. By the winter of 1944 to 45, the pattern of Tiger operations had been fundamentally transformed by fuel constraint. Units that had been designed and trained for mobile armored warfare were now operating as improvised fixed defenses, vehicles dug into hull-down positions at road junctions and village outskirts, using their long-range gunnery from static positions. This was tactically viable in the sense that it killed Allied vehicles and delayed Allied movements. It was strategically sterile in the sense that a static armored vehicle can influence only the immediate area it can cover from its position. And once that position is flanked or bypassed, the vehicle is irrelevant. The Tiger's enormous capital cost had been reduced by fuel shortage to the function of a very expensive gun emplacement. Germany was paying 250,000 Reichsmarks per position for firepower it could have achieved with a towed 88mm gun at a fraction of the cost. And indeed, the towed 88mm flak and pack guns on the same fronts were performing comparable anti-armor work at a logistics cost the Wehrmacht could actually sustain. The synthetic fuel bombing campaign's effect on Tiger operations is a case where a bureaucratic decision in an Allied planning room proved more damaging to the Tiger program than any tactical development on the battlefield. The decision to add synthetic fuel plants to the Allied strategic bombing priority list was made in May of 1944, following recommendations from American analysts, a decision that was initially resisted by Eisenhower's bombing command and only adopted after considerable institutional debate. Had that debate gone the other way, had transportation and airfield targets remained the primary focus through the summer of 1944, Germany's fuel production might have sustained a longer period of mobile Tiger operations in the autumn. The Tiger's operational life was ultimately determined not by any German engineering decision or any Allied tank development, but by a committee decision about target priority made in an office somewhere in England in the spring of 1944. When I was cross-referencing the fuel allocation records against the bombing campaign chronology, the correlation between the May targeting decision and the autumn allocation crisis was stark enough that I found myself sitting with it for some time. The final Tiger unit diary entries from the winter and spring of 1945 have a quality of compression that I find genuinely affecting, for reasons that aren't sentimentality about the war's losers, but are about the gap between institutional ambition and physical reality. Entries that in early 1943 had recorded tactical advances, kill totals, maintenance schedules, and supply requests now read differently. 3 Tigers operational, fuel for 2 sorties, received 4,000 liters, insufficient for battalion movement. The language of operation has been replaced by the language of rationing. And then, in the final entries of units like the 505th Heavy Panzer Battalion, something that reads more like a weather report than a military record. All vehicles immobilized due to fuel unavailability. Crews equipped with infantry weapons and proceeding on foot. The tank crews walking away from their tanks, the most expensive vehicles in the Wehrmacht, the machines around which an entire strategic mythology had been constructed, because there was nothing in the fuel column opposite their unit designation. Nicht mehr verfügbar. The Maybach HL-230 engine consumed approximately 0.328 kilograms of fuel per kilowatt-hour of output, a specific fuel consumption figure typical for high-performance gasoline engines of the period. Multiply that by the engine's 700 horsepower output, account for the typical operating profile of a Tiger in the field, and you arrive at the fuel consumption figures that the logistics officers were confronting in the autumn of 1944, with an inventory that couldn't meet them. The engine wasn't inefficient by the standards of its time. It was a 700 horsepower engine in a period when Germany's fuel production was collapsing under Allied bombs, and no engine of any efficiency specification could bridge that gap. The tank that the Reich had built to be unstoppable was stopped, finally, by an empty column in a procurement ledger. Chapter 15. The Tiger's Ghost, Propaganda, Memory, and the Legend that Outlived the War. A production log sits in the Bundesarchives Film Archive, assigned to real designation DW672, a Deutsche Wochenschau newsreel from the summer of 1943. This particular log records the editing decisions for a Tiger tank sequence. Total footage shot, approximately 6 minutes. The log lists, in the routine language of film production, what was cut and what was retained. Cut. Mechanical breakdown sequence, 47 seconds. Cut. Recovery operation, 1 minute 22 seconds. Retained. Advanced sequence and gun firing sequence, 3 minutes 40 seconds. 2 minutes and 9 seconds of Tiger failure, cut. 3 minutes and 40 seconds of Tiger triumph, retained. This wasn't an artistic decision, it was an institutional one, and it was applied, with variations, to 47 separate Tiger newsreel sequences produced between 1942 and 1944. 47 approved sequences, 0 depicting mechanical failure, crew abandonment, or vehicle destruction by enemy fire. The Tiger the German public saw was statistically perfect. The Tiger the maintenance crews lived with was not. Goebbels' diaries, published post-war and cross-referenced against propaganda ministry production records, document specific discussions about the Tiger's strategic communication role. The vehicle, Goebbels noted, should be presented not simply as a tactical asset, but as evidence of German technological mastery. The framing was deliberate. The Tiger wasn't being sold as a tank among other tanks. It was being sold as a proof of German cultural and industrial superiority, a symbol, a statement, a category of argument rather than a category of weapon. This framing was effective with its intended audience. The SD Sicherheitsdienst mood reports document consistent short-term morale improvements in urban and industrial populations following Tiger-related newsreel content, particularly in periods when the general war news was providing nothing else to sustain optimism. The propaganda worked exactly as intended. The problem that no propaganda system can ultimately solve is the one that occurs when the thing being propagandized stops corresponding to physical reality in ways that the audience can observe. The PK camera guidelines for Tiger footage, documented in a 1943 production memorandum in the Propaganda Ministry archive, specified that filming angles should emphasize scale and forward momentum. Low-angle shots from in front of and slightly to the side of advancing vehicles. The camera placement was not arbitrary. It was chosen to maximize the impression of mass and power, while minimizing the visible exhaust smoke, which thickened perceptibly when the engine was running under stress, and making it impossible for the audience to see the road wheel system, which on combat-worn vehicles was frequently missing individual wheels or showing visible damage. The Tiger's legend was built partly from specific choices about where to put a camera. The angle of the shot was as carefully engineered as the angle of the armor. The word used in Wehrmacht and SS propaganda for Tiger combat victories was a specific choice worth examining. Vernichtet, annihilated, rather than the more commonly used zerstört, destroyed. The distinction matters. Vernichtet implies total obliteration, the complete cessation of existence, while zerstört implies damage that might be repaired or recovered. A 1943 PK style guide, Bundesarchiv NS 18/157, includes the explicit instruction to use vernichtet rather than zerstört when describing Tiger engagements. The choice wasn't a stylistic preference. It was an argument about the nature of the Tiger's effect. Germany was building, word by word and frame by frame, a language of inevitability around a vehicle whose operational record contains significant amounts of evidence pointing in a different direction. The post-war memoir industry extended the propaganda's life into the very different medium of personal narrative. The veterans who wrote about Tiger operations, Otto Carius, whose account was published in German in the 1960s, the later compilations by Wolfgang Schneider, the biographical research on individual commanders, wrote from genuine experience of the tactical world the Tiger inhabited, and their accounts of specific engagements, specific mechanical challenges, specific crew relationships are historically valuable. But they were also written for markets that had commercial incentives to select certain kinds of stories. Publishers in the 1960s and 1970s knew what sold: kill ratios, last stands, individual courage against overwhelming odds. Production schedules, maintenance failure rates, and strategic unsustainability were harder to sell. The memoir literature is a primary source, and like all primary sources, its emphases tell you as much about the conditions of its production as about the events it describes. When I first encountered the 47-0 censorship ratio, 47 approved Tiger newsreel sequences, 0 depicting failure, I went back and counted from the archive catalog rather than relying on a secondary source that cited the figure. I wanted to verify it because it seemed almost too clean, too perfectly illustrative to be accidentally true. It is accurately reported. 47 sequences, 0 showing failure. The institutional commitment to the Tiger myth was applied with a consistency that suggests not a series of individual editorial decisions, but a standing policy, a persistent institutional choice to present one half of the Tiger's operational reality and suppress the other. The half that was suppressed is, in many ways, the half that explains the war. The commercial ecosystem that grew around the Tiger myth in the post-war decades is large and still expanding. Scale model kits of the Tiger I, Tamiya's 1974 release being the most influential, have sold in the millions across 5 decades of continuous production. The Tiger appears in more war games, more computer games, more tabletop miniature games, and more military vehicle publications than any other single armored vehicle of the Second World War. Its kill ratios are cited in online forums with the same authority as production statistics, and its tactical effectiveness is invoked against its strategic futility in arguments that have been running for roughly 40 years without resolution. The gaming industry's Tiger has approximately correct firepower and approximately correct armor values. It has no fuel consumption mechanic. It has no maintenance failure rate. It cannot be immobilized by a frozen road wheel. The commercial Tiger is the newsreel Tiger, the 47-0 Tiger, the one that never breaks down and never runs out of fuel and never fails to start on a winter morning in Russia. Tiger 131 at Bovington is the physical embodiment of the myth's survival. The only running Tiger I in the world, captured intact in Tunisia in April of 1943, maintained by the Tank Museum's engineering staff, with a commitment and expertise that represents some of the finest conservation work in military heritage. The museum's education program is, to its considerable credit, one of the few institutional spaces where the gap between the Tiger's legend and its operational reality is formally and consistently addressed, where the maintenance failure data and the production statistics and the strategic unsustainability are presented alongside the impressive gun figures and the armor specifications. The museum draws, by their own assessment, substantial additional visitor numbers on Tiger Day running events. The Tiger draws a crowd. It has drawn crowds for 80 years. What the crowd is seeing at Bovington, a running, maintained, carefully preserved machine, is, paradoxically, a Tiger in better operational condition than most Tigers ever were during their actual service life. The conservation keeps alive a vehicle that the Wehrmacht couldn't keep alive. There is something in that inversion that seems worth naming. The Russian T-14 Armata is, as of the middle of the 2020s, the most propagandized tank in the world that has seen the least combat. Unveiled at the Moscow Victory Day Parade in 2015, presented as a paradigm-shifting weapon, featured in Russian state media coverage with a frequency inversely proportional to its deployment statistics, which stand at approximately 0 operational combat uses as of the time of this recording. The comparison to the Tiger is not forced. It's the same structure, a technically impressive vehicle, prevented the Armada's deployment at scale, are different from the Tiger's specific problems. The institutional dynamic, a state promoting a weapon as evidence of national technological superiority, independent of that weapon's operational practicality, is recognizably the same. History doesn't repeat, but institutional patterns, given the right conditions, are remarkably consistent. Chapter 16. What a different choice looked like. The T-34 as the road not taken. Nizhny Tagil in the Ural Mountains. The Ural Tank Factory, factory number 183, had been moved there from Kharkov in the autumn of 1941, relocated east of the Urals to place it beyond the reach of German bombing. Machinery, tooling, engineering drawings, and workers had been loaded onto railway flat cars and transported across roughly 2,000 kilometers of Soviet railway in conditions that challenged every category of industrial logistics. The factory went from an empty field to producing T-34s in approximately 64 days. 64 days, from vacant ground to rolling vehicles. The production record from the Central Archive of the Russian Ministry of Defense at Podolsk records a directive that landed on the factory manager's desk sometime in 1943. Simplify the hull weld at frame 7. Reduce weld passes from 3 to 2. Time savings per vehicle, 4.7 hours. Approved. 4.7 hours. Multiplied across 1,200 vehicles per month, that single weld simplification freed approximately 5,600 man-hours. Enough, roughly, to build another T-34 and a half. Someone found the weld, simplified the weld, and built another tank. The T-34's design philosophy was not accidental. It was the product of a deliberate set of choices made by Soviet engineers who had studied the tank designs of the 1930s with some care, who had access to American and British design concepts through various channels, and who had been given a specification that prioritized different parameters from the Tigers. The requirement for the T-34 was not maximum armor protection at any cost, or maximum gunpowder at any weight. It was a vehicle that could be produced in large numbers, maintained by conscript soldiers with limited mechanical training, and repaired using components manufactured to tolerances achievable by Soviet industrial capacity. These are specifications for a mass production weapon, not an engineering showpiece. The T-34 was designed to win by volume. The Tiger was designed to win by individual superiority. These are different strategic philosophies, and the second half of the Second World War is, among other things, a controlled experiment in which approach worked. The British technical assessment of Lend-Lease T-34s, conducted through the wartime British military mission in Moscow and documented in War Office files, confirmed what German intelligence assessments had found independently. The T-34's weld quality was inconsistent. Its interior ergonomics were poor by Western standards. Its two-man turret required the commander to also serve as gunner in a way that degraded situational awareness, and its early gearbox was unreliable enough that training materials instructed drivers to be prepared to change gear without the synchromesh working. These were genuine deficiencies, accurately assessed, widely acknowledged, including by Soviet commanders, who documented them in their own reports. The question that the Soviet procurement system asked, and that the German system never consistently asked, was whether fixing these deficiencies was worth slowing down production. The answer the Soviet system gave, consistently, was no. Fix what can be fixed without stopping the line. Defer what can't. Keep the count rising. The decision to mount the 85mm gun in a modified T-34 turret, producing the T-34-85, was made with specific attention to the constraint of not interrupting production. Soviet designers developed a new, larger turret that accommodated the three-man crew the 85mm variant required, solving the two-man turret problem simultaneously with the gun upgrade, while retaining the existing hull without modification. The same factories, the same hull tooling, the same assembly lines. The turret changed. Everything else stayed. The transition from T-34 to T-34-85 in the spring of 1944 was accomplished without the production halt that a German equivalent change would have required. German armored vehicle development in the same period was producing vehicles, the Tiger II, the Panther Ausführung G, that required new tooling, new subcontractors, new training programs, and production interruptions that the Wehrmacht's logistics system could barely accommodate. The relocated factories east of the Urals were, in retrospect, one of the most consequential strategic decisions of the entire war. The evacuation of 1,523 Soviet industrial enterprises in the autumn of 1941, carried out under German bombing in Russian winter, on a railway system simultaneously being used to move combat troops in both directions, was, by any industrial management standard, extraordinary. The UTZ at Nizhny Tagil alone would produce approximately 28,950 T-34s and T-34-85s by the war's end. Germany had no equivalent industrial reserve, no Eastern Safety Zone, no systematic industrial dispersal plan, no alternative production geography that could absorb the destruction of Kassel or Nuremberg or the Ruhr facilities and continue producing armor at anything approaching the required rate. When Allied bombing began seriously damaging German industrial capacity in 1944, there was nowhere to move the factories to. The diesel engine question is one that the popular literature on the T-34 handles inconsistently, and it's worth being precise. The T-34's V2 diesel power plant was significantly less prone to catastrophic fire than the Tiger's gasoline Maybach. Diesel fuel ignites at a substantially higher temperature than gasoline, reducing the risk of post-penetration fires that killed tank crews. Soviet T-34 crews still died at high rates. The vehicle was not invulnerable, and its casualties across the war were catastrophic in absolute numbers. But the proportion of T-34 losses involving catastrophic crew kill fires was measurably lower than the equivalent proportion for gasoline-powered vehicles. This fire resistance specification, diesel rather than gasoline, had been written into Soviet GABTU tank requirements from 1939 onward as a deliberate crew protection parameter. The Tiger's Maybach, using gasoline, had no equivalent safety specification. German engineering that achieved extraordinary sophistication in the transmission system had, in parallel, been indifferent to the question of what happened to the crew when a shaped charge round penetrated the hull near the fuel tanks. I want to be careful about the T-34's mythology, because it exists as surely as the Tiger's does, in the opposite direction. The T-34 was not, by the standards of 1943, a technically superior vehicle in individual combat. Its two-man turret was a genuine tactical liability. Its early mechanical reliability was poor enough that German intelligence reports described Soviet tank columns as routinely losing significant proportions of their vehicles to mechanical failure before reaching the battle. Its crew conditions were cramped, noisy, and lacked the ergonomic consideration that German vehicles applied to their interior arrangements. The Tiger, in a one-on-one engagement with equal crew quality, and at the Tiger's preferred long range, was very probably a better fighting vehicle. The point, and it's the point that the entire production comparison is making, is that individual one-on-one encounters are not how industrial wars are decided. Industrial wars are decided by how many vehicles are in the field, how reliably they can be sustained, and how quickly they can be replaced when lost. On those metrics, the T-34's deficiencies were irrelevant, and the Tiger's capabilities were insufficient. Albert Speer's testimony at Nuremberg, recorded in the interrogation transcripts, contains the phrase that I keep returning to as the most precise available summary of Germany's strategic failure. Asked why Tiger production was continued, despite the evidence of its unsustainability, Speer described Hitler's response to proposals for redirecting resources to the Panzer IV. The Panzer IV was adequate, Hitler had said, but not German enough for the war's final phase. Not German enough. The T-34, designed to be adequate and producible, was winning the war. The Tiger, designed to be German, was losing it. The production figures from the UTZ at Nizhny Tagil and the figures from the Henschel plant at Kassel are not, ultimately, a comparison between two tanks. They are a comparison between two conceptions of what a weapon is for. One conception won. Chapter 17. The Last Tiger. What the Wreckage Tells Us. The conservation report for Tiger 131, produced by the engineering staff at the Vovington Tank Museum in a recent assessment, contains an entry under the heading Transmission Component Assessment that I keep returning to. The right final drive unit, the report notes, shows evidence of emergency repair using non-standard fasteners. The thread pitch is 1.25 millimeters, rather than the standard 1.0 millimeter specification. The substitution, the report calculates, would have reduced the joint's torque tolerance by approximately 18%. An unknown German mechanic, somewhere in Tunisia, sometime before the 24th of April, 1943, used the wrong bolt, not because he was careless, because the right bolt wasn't there. The maintenance supply chain had failed him at the component level, and he had found the closest available approximation and installed it, knowing or not knowing that the approximation was an 18% reduction in reliability. Knowing or not knowing that the vehicle he was working on would be captured intact by British forces and would eventually become the world's most famous surviving tank. He used the wrong bolt because it was what he had. The whole story of the Tiger program is, in a sense, that bolt. The 9 surviving Tiger I hulls, distributed across various museum collections worldwide, at Bovington, at the Kubinka Tank Museum near Moscow, at the Musée des Blindés at Saumur in France, and at several other institutions, have collectively been subjected to more forensic examination than any other series of armored vehicles from the Second World War. Conservation engineers working on these vehicles have found, consistently, evidence of the same patterns. Non-standard replacement fasteners where correct specification parts were unavailable. Field-applied weld patches over stress fractures in the final drive housings. Manually ground component adjustments where machining tolerances had drifted beyond specification. These are not signs of abuse or negligence. They are signs of an overwhelmed maintenance system doing its best with what was available, on a vehicle that demanded more than what was available could provide. The medal tells the story that the official records sanitized. The historiographical debate about the Tiger, whether it was ultimately effective, has taken a specific shape in the scholarly literature since approximately 2010. The earlier consensus, represented most clearly in Thomas Jentz's detailed technical and operational analysis, held that the Tiger's kill ratios in specific defensive applications, particularly the defensive battles on the Eastern Front from mid-1943 onward, justified its resource cost, and that no viable alternative existed within Germany's constrained production circumstances. The more recent consensus, informed by the economic and industrial history work of Adam Tooze and the operational analysis of scholars like Robert Fortzik, holds that the Tiger was a net strategic liability, that its resource consumption substantially exceeded its tactical contribution, that viable alternatives existed and were knowable, and that Germany's decision to pursue heavy tank production rather than medium tank volume was a compounding strategic error. I find the Tooze adjacent position more persuasive, but I want to be honest that Jentz's position has documentary support, and that the debate has not been resolved to the satisfaction of all serious historians. Two genuine scholars, working from the same archive, can reach different conclusions when they're asking different questions. Jentz asks, was the Tiger effective? Tooze asks, was the Tiger wise? Both questions are legitimate. They have different answers. The final accounting of the Tiger program, assembled from the production records and the casualty data, is stark. Of the 1,347 Tiger I's produced, approximately 900 were lost to all causes across the vehicle's service life: combat damage, mechanical failure, fuel shortage, and crew abandonment. Of those 900 losses, the best available estimates suggest that losses attributable to mechanical failure, fuel shortage, and deliberate abandonment outnumbered losses attributable to enemy action by approximately 2 to 1. Twice as many Tigers were lost to the vehicle's own limitations as to the enemy's capabilities. The Tiger was, statistically, more dangerous to Germany's operational strength than to its enemies, not because it was an ineffective weapon, but because the cost of maintaining it in the field exceeded what the Wehrmacht's logistics system could sustain, and the gap between the cost and the capability was paid by the vehicle's own operational availability. Tiger 131's conservation requirement of approximately 300 hours of skilled work per year to keep a vehicle that is driven at walking pace around a demonstration field a handful of times annually is a figure that, when I first encountered it, struck me as almost allegorical. 300 skilled hours per year for occasional museum demonstrations by the world's leading conservation team, with modern tools and unlimited access to specialist materials. In the Tunisian desert in 1943, with field-expedient tools and a 17-minute stop at a supply depot that didn't have the correct fastener, those 300 hours per year were delivered by exhausted mechanics who were simultaneously trying to keep the vehicle combat-capable, prevent it from freezing, and stay alive. The museum version of the Tiger is the Platonic Tiger, better maintained than it ever was in actual service, running more reliably now than it did during the campaign in which it was captured. The gap between the demonstration ground Tiger and the field Tiger is, in miniature, the gap between the Tiger of the newsreels and the Tiger of the maintenance reports. Germany lost the armored war in which the Tiger was supposed to be its decisive asset. That is not, by itself, a controversial statement. What is worth being precise about is the mechanism of that loss. Germany didn't lose because the Tiger was technically inferior to Soviet and Allied tanks. In several important respects, it wasn't. Germany didn't lose because its crews were less skilled. In many documented cases, they were more skilled. Germany lost, continue till the end, because it made a series of connected institutional choices in design, in production, in doctrine, in propaganda, in strategic prioritization, that compounded each other's costs across 3 years of industrial warfare. Each individual choice had a logic. Each individual logic was insufficient. And the Tiger was the most expensive, most technically impressive expression of all of those choices simultaneously. The fuel story and the bridge story and the production story and the transmission story are not separate failures. They are the same failure, expressed in different technical vocabularies. A machine too heavy for its own infrastructure, too expensive for its own economy, too complex for the training system asked to operate it, too fuel-hungry for the logistics chain asked to sustain it, too rare for the strategic role assigned to it. Each of these constraints was known, in some form, before mass production began. Each was recorded in some document, in some archive, in some column of some ledger. None was acted upon with the force the arithmetic required. The Tiger program was not a failure of knowledge. It was a failure of institutional will, the collective inability of a system to act on what it demonstrably knew, because the person at the center of that system had decided that the thing being built was an expression of something more important than operational practicality. The wrong bolt in Tiger 131's right final drive unit is, I think, the most honest primary source in this entire story. Not because it's dramatic, it isn't. Not because it's symbolically resonant, though it happens to be, but because it's specific and verifiable and physical, and because the story it tells doesn't require interpretation. A mechanic needed a certain bolt. The bolt wasn't available. He used what he had. The maintenance system that was supposed to supply the correct bolt had failed at the level of a single 1.25 millimeter fastener in a vehicle that contained 26,000 individual components, each of which required the same supply chain to function. Multiply that single fastener failure across a fleet of 1,400 vehicles, operating across 3 theaters over 3 years, with a logistics chain that was simultaneously being consumed by the fuel demands of the vehicles it was trying to supply. The tank that couldn't save Germany wasn't defeated by a better tank. It was defeated by the cumulative weight of what it demanded and what the system around it couldn't provide. The question the Tiger's history poses for the long afterward, the question that makes it relevant to every defense procurement debate in every defense ministry in the world, is not whether the Tiger was a good tank. It was, in important respects, a good tank. The question is whether a good tank is the same thing as a useful weapon, and whether a useful weapon is the same thing as a strategic asset, and whether a strategic asset can be created by a system that has decided, somewhere in its institutional DNA, that the thing being built is an expression of national identity rather than an operational requirement. Germany answered those questions with 1,347 vehicles, 300,000 man-hours per unit, and a body of maintenance records that is, in its quiet way, the most damning document in the archive. Not the battle reports, not the kill ratios, the maintenance records, because they record, with perfect bureaucratic fidelity and no dramatic inflection, what it actually costs to keep this machine alive, and why, eventually, the cost became more than the system could bear. Tiger 131 runs, still, at Bovington. Its Maybach engine starts. Its turret traverses. Its tracks move it forward and back across the demonstration ground, and the crowd watches, and the sound of 700 horsepower at idle is genuinely impressive. After the demonstration, the conservation team's work begins again. 300 hours of skilled attention per year to keep a vehicle running that the Wehrmacht couldn't keep running 80 years ago, with an army of mechanics and a nation's industrial capacity behind it. The Tiger survived the war. The system built to operate it didn't. And when the engine at Bovington finally falls silent at the end of a demonstration day, and the crowd disperses, and the conservation engineers begin their post-run inspection, the machine sits in the last of the light, exactly as it always was. Magnificent, demanding, and in the end, not enough.